Okay, so 2 o'clock. Welcome to the third day of the Conrad 47th International Virtual Conference. And I'm going to hand straight over to Catherine Baxter, who's going to be the chairperson for this session. Again, we'll break at 3:15 for 10 minutes, and then we'll be back for the second panel. So, Catherine, I hand over to you.
Thanks, Kim, and welcome everybody. And yeah, I just want to echo everyone's thanks so far to Kim and Mary, particularly for all their work in putting this together. It's fantastic. And I'm really looking forward to this third day and particularly to this session. We've got 4 papers and as we've done in the previous couple of days, I'll introduce each person before their paper and we should have some time at the end for questions. And if you have questions that you want to ask sort of that are in your head immediately, feel free to put them in the chat, but I will just wait until we get to the end before we ask our speakers to respond. So our first speaker today is Nidesh Lotu. He's Assistant Professor of English and Philosophy at KU Leuven in Belgium. And he's also Principal Investigator of an ERC-funded project entitled Homo Mimeticus, Theory and Criticism. He's the editor of Conrad's Heart of Darkness and Contemporary Thought, which came out in 2012, and with Chris Gogwelt and Ellenbert Harrington, co-edited a special issue of Conradiana entitled Conradian Crosscurrents, Creativity and Critique, and that came out in 2016. His books rethink the problematic of mimesis in light of contemporary challenges, and they include The Phantom of the Ego, Modernism and the Mimetic Unconscious from 2013, New Fascism, Contagion, Myth and Community, which came out last year, and Conrad's Shadows, Catastrophe, Mimesis and Mimesis Theory, which was published in 2016 and won the Adam Gillan Award in 2018. Today, he's going to be speaking and sharing with us, because I think this is sort of a multimedia presentation called Reading Conrad in Catastrophic Times, the Mimetic Term. Thanks, Nidesh.
Thanks so much, Catherine, for this nice introduction, and thanks to Kim and everybody for making this possible. As I was telling Kim and the other panelists before, these are not normal times, and so I thought I would do something a little bit abnormal. I hope you don't mind. Something a bit experimental. And just to provide a little bit of context for it, I was driving through a special location, which you will see in a moment during the summer. And this location was important to Conrad. And so I thought, oh, this would provide a better setting than my office for the talk. And then I also realized that that location might also be relevant for the current situation we find ourselves in. So I'll be showing you this video. Just maybe, Catherine, let me know if the sound and the image works, and I will disappear from the screen myself, and okay, then I'll let Phantom appear. And let's see if that works. Does an image appear?
Yes, it does.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you to the organizers of this virtual Joseph Conrad conference. Since we're all digitally distant and we only see mimetic shadows or phantoms far removed from reality, I thought it would be interesting to situate this talk within the context of a setting that was very important to Conrad. I find myself at the heart of the Swiss Alps, on the Furka Pass, above 2,400 meters. And as Conrad explains in a personal record, this is the location that apparently he claims had an important impact on his future career. Upon seeing an Englishman climbing in an adventurous fashion, following a Swiss guide, Joseph Conrad decided to start or to dream of a career at sea that eventually led to the writings that we're all familiar with. Now, it's interesting that a pass is a locus of transition. You hear it in the Italian passo, the verb passare, to pass or to transition from one location to the other. And in Conrad's case, it was a transition, an imaginary, maybe mythic transition from a life located on land to a life at sea that eventually led to a life at a writing desk. For critics, 100 years and more removed from this mythic episode, we find ourselves in a somewhat similar situation, in the sense that doing literary criticism in the age of the Anthropocene and in a period plagued by global pandemics requires a kind of imagination and adaptation that leads to changing practices, as this virtual conference demonstrates. Now, in order to live up and to face some of the challenges of doing literary criticism in the 21st century, over the past 10 years, I've developed what I came to call a mimetic turn in literary studies. It's a mimetic turn that concerns literary theory, modernism or new modernist studies more generally, but that finds in Conrad's studies a specific starting point, and I've devoted a number of years to working on Conrad's tales. And so the mimetic turn starts in many ways in Conrad's fictions. I should perhaps specify that the mimetic turn in Conrad's studies does not entail a return to simple realism. Mimesis is often restricted to realistic representations of reality, and Joseph Conrad obviously transgresses in his fictions realism. What I mean with mimesis is much broader understanding of humans as mimetic creatures, as creatures that, for better and worse, are open to imitation. And my claim is that when Joseph Conrad says that, in his case, the Homo duplex has more than one meaning, the meanings of the Homo duplex in Conrad's fictions overlap in significant ways with the ancient definition of mimesis that was rooted in mimetic practices that led to forms of dramatic or mimetic impersonations that confused the boundary between self and other, fiction and reality, and led to forms of affects that are mimetic in the sense that they are contagious and spread from self to other. And so for this talk, I thought I would give you 3 examples of moments in Conrad's corpus that prompt this mimetic turn in ways that are relevant, I think, for Conrad studies and literary studies and the humanities more generally. So I'll be giving you just very briefly 3 examples, each accompanied by a methodological implication. The first is political. It has to do with the relationship between mimesis and politics. And the locus classicus to think about mimesis and politics in Conrad studies is perhaps Heart of Darkness. What I find interesting in Marlowe's definition of Kurtz is that already in this tale, Marlowe calls attention to the power of leaders who are hollow at the core and yet manage to electrify large meetings on the popular front, Conrad specifies. Now, this power of leaders that are hollow and nonetheless, through their voice, manage to cast a spell on crowds, often by the use of media, is something that we are witnessing today through the rise of what I've been calling new fascism.
I don't have time to enter into the definition of new fascism, which I explain elsewhere, but my argument is that Conrad's political tales and the political implications of mimesis can serve as allies in order to fight contra the rise of new fascism. Insofar as Conrad calls attention to the power of leaders with a tyrannical bent to exploit what Walter Benjamin called the mimetic faculty, especially of crowds, but a faculty that is amplified by new media. The methodological implication of this anecdote is that mimetic theory is not applied to the tale, it's not applied to Heart of Darkness. On the contrary, the theoretical insights that hollow leaders have an impact on crowds is already internal to Conrad's fiction. And so the mimetic turn is in many ways a return to close reading and paying close attention to the theoretical implications of Conrad's tales. The second example is perhaps even more directly relevant to the contemporary crisis. And for that example, I'll read you a brief excerpt from a book that appeared 3 years ago titled Conrad Shadow, Catastrophe, Mimesis Theory, where I developed at more length the implications of Conrad's mimetic turn. But the passage I want to read to you is a passage subtitled Surviving Epidemics in the Shadow Line. And since we are going through a pandemic, I think that it resonates to the contemporary moment. The passage reads as follows. After the escalating violence of total wars and the threat of perfect storms, Conrad urges us to turn to yet another catastrophe that casts a shadow on the past, the modern, as well as the contemporary imagination. The spread of epidemic contagion. And so in many ways, this chapter is an attempt to see how Conrad helps us diagnose an epidemic crisis. And I position my reading in an agonistic relationship with René Girard, who argues that the plague in literature is very often metaphorical of a more human crisis that has to do with mimetic desire. And my argument is that in Conrad tales, we are forced to take literally the threat of epidemic contagion. The passage continues as follows. From the plague of HIV that spread across the world in the 1980s and 90s and continues to infect the wretched of the earth, as Fanon calls them, to the contemporary pandemics that every year threaten to contaminate an increasingly globalized, permeable, and precarious world, the shadow of epidemics looms large on the horizon. Hence the need to supplement Girard's hermeneutics in light of what epidemiologists call the threat of the coming plague. Hence the urgency to turn back to a writer like Conrad, who, before contemporary theorists, put readers back in touch with the literal effects of pathological contagion. Epidemic infections, in what follows, shall thus be treated à la lettre. Now, I've written these lines in 2016, and since I do not claim prophetic powers, once again, tribute goes to Conrad, who, in the Shadow Line, dramatized the effects of epidemics in ways that led the critic to take the threat of epidemic contagion seriously. Now, the theoretical point that I want to emphasize in relationship to mimesis and epidemic contagion is that Conrad's tales force us to take into closer account the complicated relationship between the background and the foreground, the non-human forces that he dramatizes in his tale, and the human, all-to-human forces that he fictionalizes. And very often there are elements of contagion, in this case viral contagion, that emerge out of the dynamic interplay of non-human and human forces. The example in the Shadow Line is the example of a young, inexperienced captain who initially puts himself at a distance from the crew. And what the epidemic reveals is that using the ship as a metaphor of the body politic, what the tale reveals is that the head of the state of the ship is as vulnerable to the epidemic as the crew, that there is no distinction between head and body or body politic when it comes to epidemic contagion. And once again, this is something that we have seen, of course, in England and in other parts of the world, where leaders who initially treated the pandemic lightly were affected themselves by the pandemic and changed attitude with respect to that. So that insight that the head is as vulnerable to pandemics as the community is internal to Conrad, there for critics to discover. And so, as I said, the methodological implication of this particular element of Conrad's mimetic turn is that non-human forces need to be treated in relationship to human forces, and that critical attention needs to be given to the interplay between the non-human and the human. Now, this is a lesson internal to critical turns like new materialism, but once again, the mimetic turn finds these insights internal, embryonic, in Conrad's tales themselves. Now, the third and last example that I want to leave you with is that after the threat of the rise of new fascist leader and the affective contagion that they generate and the political pathologies that they generate and the threat of epidemic contagion that affects the head as much as the body via a viral contagion, Conrad is equally attentive to the positive implications of mimesis. Very often, the positive form of mimesis emerges as a reaction against the pathological side of mimetic contagion, be it affective and political or viral and medical. And so one of the insights of Conrad's mimetic turn is that mimetic pathologies can be countered by forms of what I call mimetic pathologies, understood as critical accounts on the force of pathos or affect. And one of the pathological insight that emerges from the shadow line, but also other tales, is that solidarity and communal bonding is something that is vital in order to affirm survival in catastrophic scenarios. This is true in the case of the threat of contagion, the case of the shadow line, but it's also true more generally, I think, in the age of the Anthropocene. And I return to this setting in which we've seen there is still snow on the mountains, but the glaciers are speedily retreating. And as we enter deeper into the age of the Anthropocene, it is vital to affirm forms of communal solidarity between what Conrad called the living and the dead, but also, as he famously puts it, between the living and the unborn, calling for a form of intergenerational solidarity that is crucial to the ethical turn constitutive of Conrad's mimetic turn in the age of the Anthropocene. So 3 examples of Conrad's mimetic turn in relationship to mimetic politics, in relationship to epidemic contagion, and finally in relationship to communal solidarity in order to face the shadows of multiple catastrophes that haunt the age of the Anthropocene. I hope that these examples are stimulating. Of course, they're a starting point that call for further development, but I hope that they reveal at least 2 points. One, that the mimetic turn speak to the contemporary crisis, and is already internal to Conrad's tales. And the second, I don't need to convince you of that, I'm sure, is that Conrad continues to remain one of us in the age of the Anthropocene. So thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Nadesh. That was fabulous. And goodness, those hills looked nice.
Yeah, I thought it would be better than this background.
Look, lovely. Thank you. That was really fascinating. And I'm sure we'll have some good conversation to come. But before then, I'm really pleased to be introducing our next speaker, Cedric Watts. So after service in the Royal Navy, Cedric Watts took a BA, first class in English, and a doctorate at Cambridge University. And thereafter he taught English at Sussex University and is currently Professor Emeritus there. He's published poems, tales, and of course numerous critical and scholarly books, notably Joseph Conrad Nostromo. He's also written fiction, and his novel Final Exam, written under the name Peter Green, has been praised by Ian McEwan. And today he's going to be talking to us with the title Thematic Precipitation in Conrad's Works. So Cedric, I shall hand over to you.
Thank you, Catherine. That's very kind of you. Yes, the title is Thematic Precipitation in Conrad's Works. In chemistry, a saturated solution may precipitate solids. In a fictional work, a replete theme may precipitate an image or a name. Then the abstract becomes concrete, the metaphorical becomes literal, the large and pervasive precipitate the small and specific, and irony is generated. Here are some examples. 1. The spectacles in Nostromo. In the author's note, 1917, to Nostromo, Conrad says that the novel concerns moral myopia, men short-sighted in good and evil. He is quoting a paragraph that appeared in the first 1904 edition of the novel, but after the first edition, the paragraph containing that important thematic phase was deleted from the text of Nostromo. There is no doubt that the novel does indeed illustrate moral myopia. Charles Gould thinks that the mine will bring a better era. He does not foresee the industrial strife to come. Nostromo steals the silver, but he does not foresee how he will be burdened by guilt. Decoud does not foresee how isolation will demoralize him. The precipitated image is the pair of spectacles that Emilia Gould gives to old Giorgio Viola to rectify his myopia. The spectacles have silver frames, of course, because Conrad has worked hard to get silver into as many parts of the novel as possible, even that concluding paragraph where a cloud shines like a mass of solid silver. Typically of the novel, the spectacles do not avert disaster. Viola forgets to wear them when she's seeking to shoot an interloper. The result is that he shoots Nostromo. The gift by Emilia is characteristic of her function as Lady Alman in the novel, seeking by her benefactions to ameliorate the society which has been transformed by capitalism. You could say that this gift of spectacles fails to avert disaster, and thereby it makes an ironic comment on her endeavours. 2. The mirror in The Duel. The narrator of this novella emphasised the contrast between the two antagonists. Pharaoh, as his name suggests, is feral, tigerish, the instinctive man who harbours a deep resentment against Dubert. The Latin noun fera means a wild beast. Dubert, in contrast, is a reflective man, thoughtful, caring, and responsible. Repeatedly, he is termed reflective Dubert. Dubert, the reflective. The theme reflective man versus instinctive man has generated Pharaoh's name, and it precipitates a specific image in the final duel. Dubert uses a looking glass, a small mirror, to spy on Pharaoh. The manner of reflection employs a small reflective surface, and this helps to bring about the denouement in which Dubert repeats Pharaoh. 3. The Gilt Sixpence in Karain. In this fine short story, one extensive theme is haunting that solicits exorcism. A coin is used as a fake talisman that exorcises the ghost haunting Karain. It's a Victorian Golden Jubilee sixpence showing the head of Queen Victoria. As Karain reveres Queen Victoria, his faith in the false talisman is easily explained. But what is precipitated by the theme haunting that solicits exorcism is not just the sixpence, a necessary part of the plot, but the fact that it is gilt and perforated. The Jubilee sixpence of 1887 was a numismatic blunder, a scandal of the time. This silver coin was exactly the same size and had the same design as the Gold House sovereign, worth 20 times more. So dishonest people had their silver sixpences gilded, painted gold, so that they could be passed as half sovereigns. Therefore, the gilt, gilded and guilty sixpence used by Hollis is doubly fraudulent. It is not only no talisman, it is also a fraudulent coin. Furthermore, it has been perforated near the rim, which makes it easier to hang on a ribbon round Parame's neck. But that perforation has rendered it worthless as currency. So the false talisman, though psychologically effective, is trebly deceptive. It thus makes a bitterly ironic comment on the civilization to which Karain has looked for salvation. One theme in the Niger Narcissus, to bring me to item 4, is the black man burdens and delays the ship. Conrad was writing 2 years before Kipling published his poem, The White Man's Burden. The fact the black man on the Narcissus is both a weight and a delayer precipitates his surname, Weight, a homonym for delay, and a homophone for weight, spelled W-E-I-G-H-T. 5. Sunset in Heart of Darkness. One theme of this novella is, where is the heart of darkness? Conrad was familiar with the patriotic slogan, the British Empire is the empire on which the sun never sets. He quotes it in The Secret Agent. The theme and the slogan have precipitated the ominous sunset at the start of the tale, which suggests, paradoxically, that one heart of darkness is actually London. And the sun certainly does set on this heart of empire. We see an ominous, brooding gloom. Another theme is the extent of the ivory trade. This precipitates the bones, the dominoes, near the beginning of the novella, and the grand piano, which would have had ivory keys, near the end. A third theme is the falsehood of imperialism, hence the name Kurz, which means concise, though his report is long-winded, and short, though he looks at least 7 feet long. 6. Haunting in Under Western Eyes. Victor Haldin says that after death, my spirit shall go on warring in some Russian body. One theme of this novel is this: after his death, a man may haunt the living. This theme precipitates the peculiarly masculine features which manifest themselves when Razumov first meets Natalia Haldin. Her first words to Razumov, as though she is introducing herself, are Victor Haldin, and we have been told that her voice is deep, almost harsh, while her handshake has a sort of exquisite virility. Razumov says later, when you stood before me with your hand extended, I remembered the very sound of his voice. I remembered that he had looked to you for the perpetuation of his visionary soul. Another theme is the need to confess. This precipitates the statue of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, author of Les Confessions. A third theme is misguided faith in reason. Razumov proudly refers to his cool, superior reason. This has precipitated the name Razumov, which means son of reason. 7. Villainy in Victory. In the supernatural covert plot of Victory, one theme is the nature of villainy. This precipitates the name Jones, a gentleman. In King Lear, Edgar says, the Prince of Darkness is a gentleman. That is proverbial. Seamen know that Davy Jones is the name of the devil, and Davy Jones's locker is a location of drowned seamen. Appropriately, in the novel, Jones finally drowns. The diabolic connotation of his name are confirmed when Jones tells Hayes this: having been ejected from his proper social sphere because he had refused to conform to certain usual conventions, he was a rebel now and is coming and going up and down the earth. Hayes says, I had heard that sort of story about somebody else before. John Milton's Paradise Lost, books 1 and 2, tell us how Satan refused to conform to certain usual conventions in heaven. He rebelled through pride, fought the war in heaven, was defeated and sent to hell. According to the book of Job, chapter 1, verse 7 and chapter 2, verse 2, Satan spends time going to and fro in the earth and walking up and down it. Allegoric excess, Mars victory. 8. I leave you to spot the precipitation in the secret sharer. A final observation, I've assumed that the theme precedes the name or image. Just possibly a name or image may generate a theme, or all three may appear simultaneously. But I believe that these possibilities would be rare and exceptional. I therefore commend to you the term thematic precipitation. The end.
Thank you, Cedric. Thank you. That was fascinating, and what a wonderful kind of whip through so many of Conrad's novels. That was really a real pleasure.
At a time.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, in interesting ways, kind of picking up on some of the things that Nidesh had been talking about, although in a kind of different sort of discursive way. So thank you, that was great. So we turn now to Eva Kojowska-Lis, who is professor in the Institute of Literary Studies at the University of Valmir and Missouri in Olsztyn, Poland. Her interest in theoretical and empirical research on translation focuses on the works of Dickens, Chesterton and Conrad, and she's contributed to Dickens Quarterly, Conradiana and Conradian. In 2011, she published in Polish Marlowe Under the Polish Flag, Joseph Conrad's tetralogy in Polish translations from 1904 to 2004. And this is a comprehensive analysis of Polish translations which feature Conrad's narrator, Marlowe. She's also interested in early translations of Dickens' work into Polish and his reception in Poland. And that gives rise, I think, to the paper today, which is called Dickens and Conrad, Narrative and Stylistic Influences. Thanks, Eva. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Catherine. I feel totally overwhelmed after those two papers. Can you see my screen?
Not yet, Eva, but
I'm trying to share the screen, but okay.
It's not come up yet, but let's see.
Okay. Nothing? All right, it doesn't matter. I'll try again. Okay, how about now?
Yeah, that's coming up now. Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, right. I'm afraid this will be much more Dickensian than Conradian, so if you fall asleep, you can grab a cup of coffee before the presentation, please. Okay, Dickens's impact on Conrad is multifaceted and all well explored. Some critics, like Ian Watt, downplayed the relationship between Conrad and Victorian literature, Dickens in particular, by arguing that Conrad's basic conception of the novel was not English, or was not of English origin. For Conrad, the exemplary novelists were French. Still, ever since Lewis's assertion that Dickens may have counted for more in Conrad's mature art than seems at first probable, studies devoted to this issue have emerged. Some scholars juxtapose particular works, especially The Secret Agent and Bleak House, as well as Chance and Little Dorrit. Others trace thematic and formal similarities in the novels of both writers. Some, like Robert Caserio, believe that Dickens ought to be considered a context for all Conrad's work. Conrad drew his literary methods from writers as different as Sterne, Richardson, Dostoevsky, Dickens, Flaubert, and James, obviously. Now, here he worked often creatively, entire passages from the French writers, to the point that the dreaded word plagiarism loomed over his art. Critics carefully avoided this term, nevertheless proving that his borrowings are so obvious, numerous, and varied that it's abundantly clear that Conrad was highly conscious of those original texts. In short, we are faced with a deliberate mode of composition. As for English literature, and as argued by Hugh, hello Hugh, thank you for your inspiration. Dickens's writing is, Conrad's writing is permitted by his lifelong experience of reading Dickens. Dickensian influences are less amenable to detection and generally more diffuse than the evident verbal echoes of French authors. Both English and French influences stem, to my mind, from Conrad's voracious reading and his extraordinary ability to absorb texts in foreign languages. Conrad was intimately familiar with Dickens, whom he discovered as a child in Polish translations of his father's library, and then as an adult, Dickens, along with Shakespeare and Byron, was his major source when learning English. In his personal record, he names Dickens as the patron of his literary career and juxtaposes Dickensian characters with his acquaintances. Now, reading literary texts was for Conrad not only a way to develop his intellectual and aesthetic taste, but also a language learning strategy, especially to expand his vocabulary. Importantly, stamped itself on his memory in terms of creative energy and literary solutions, especially when his thematic interests were similar to those of other writers. Yet Conrad moves beyond the mere assimilation of Dickensian elements, as was the case with French passages, and they become a springboard for his own ideas. And as Hugh comments about this, Dickens's habitually grotesque satire and his predilection for the incongruous and the beyond Conrad's composing mind, not so much with precise examples, lessons, and locutions, as with starting points for Conrad's own and even more visionary distortions and manipulations of narrative style into an arrestingly original mode that carries his own signature, authorized as it were by his predecessor. Now, I wish to argue that what Conrad is credited with and admired for, he may have developed from Pip's first-person narrative in Great Expectations. Like Mraiden narrators, Dickens's character narrator is very fond of withholding information from the reader and presenting strong impressions of a character to catch the reader's attention to later provide a more in-depth explanation. Additionally, Conrad's adjectival insistence, for which he was heavily criticized by Davies, especially pairing of two almost synonymous adjectives, may be tracked back to Dickens's style. Thus, Dickens's writing that in his adulthood served Conrad to learn English was not only a source of aesthetic enjoyment, but may have imprinted in him certain stylistic habits and may have inspired him to develop his most famous impressionist narrative techniques. Now, Pip is telling the story of his life according to his individual experiences and perspectives. As the autodiegetic narrator, Pip focalizes the narrative according to his cognition and potential, but does so in a specific manner. He often focuses on particular sensations evoked and operates through the implicit rather than explicit, though he provides details. The first description of Jaggers, stressing the size of his hand, implies unlimited influence and control. He took my chin in his large hand and turned up my face to have a look at me by the light of the candle. Then Pip notices, of course, the most characteristic feature. His hand smelled of scented soap. This observation has two functions. It characterizes Jaggers as one who excessively cares about hygiene, implying his economic and moral status. Jaggers' soap-scented hands designate his moral and social standing. In mid-Victorian times, cleanliness, like good manners, became an indicator of respectability, while dirt and squalor were seen as threats to moral as well as physical health. On the narrative level at that point, no further implication can be drawn. Since the story is told chronologically from Pip's perspective, like Pip, we can't understand the reference to the scented soap, yet the description of Jaggers' hands signals to the reader that he will be a character of great importance. This may have inspired Conrad to develop his chronological looping. This is how Joseph Warren Beach termed novel narrative methods to describe how Conrad first gives a strong impression of a character or situation so as to catch the reader's attention before bringing the light of retrospection and anticipation to explain and modify the impression. As stressed by Ian Watt, Beach's term concentrates on the looping, that is, the juxtaposition in the narrative sequence of events which would not follow each other if the story were told chronologically. It's quite likely that Conrad borrowed Dickens's narrative methods and modified them to meet his ends in his impressionistic fiction, in which he employs prolepsis and analepsis. In Great Expectations, a typical Bildungsroman told chronologically, Pip gives a strong impression of Jaggers and deliberately withdraws information about the meaning of soap-scented hands, though he obviously knows it since the story is told retrospectively. He creates a kind of a time loop between the first mention of Jaggers and the explanation of the significance of focusing on the lawyer's hand. He explains the source of smell only when he himself witnesses Jaggers' ritualistic hand washing. What he offers initially is the sensory impression, the smell, as at the time during the first encounter with the lawyer, he himself knew and felt no more. The first description of Jaggers and other scenes involving this character are reminiscent of a very crude form of delayed decoding. This technique is based on the postponing of the interpretive process. As mastered later by Conrad, it takes us directly into the observer's consciousness at the very moment of the perception, before it's been translated into its cause. Decoding involves the reception of the image data as perceived through the narrator's senses, vision, hearing, smell, but failing to apprehend it correctly owing to the lack of appropriate information. This results in the imperfect knowledge delivered by the narrator. A sort of delayed decoding may be found in the scene when Jaggers forces Molly to show her wrists. That's a longer quotation. Suddenly he clapped his large hand on the housekeeper's like a trap, and she stretched it across the table. Molly, said Mr. Jaggers, not looking at her, but obstinately looking at the opposite side of the room. Let them see both your wrists. Show them. Come. He took his hands from hers and turned that wrist up on the table. She brought her other hand from behind her and held the two out side by side. The last wrist was much disfigured, deeply scarred and scarred across and across. When she held her head out, she took her eyes from Mr. Jaggers and turned them watchfully on every one of the rest of us in succession. There's power here, said Mr. Jaggers, coolly tracing out the sinews with his forefinger. Very few men have the power of wrist that this woman has. It's remarkable what mere force of grip there is in these hands. I have had occasion to notice many hands, but I never saw stronger in that respect, man's or woman's, than these. That will do, Molly, said Mr. Jaggers, giving her a slight nod. You've been admired and can go. She withdrew her hands and went out of the room. This powerful description captures attention and has the potential to affect the reader so that it remains deeply seated in the memory and can resurface in specific circumstances. This was the case with the novelist Sarah Waters, whose memory of Molly's hands had stayed with her and gradually came back to consciousness as she wrote her own novel, Affinity. Apart from creating a strong, almost Gothic visual impression, Dickens utilizes this scene for generating suspense and evoking a feeling of confusion and uncertainty, both within the fictional world and for readers. The experience of reading this passage may have also stayed with Conrad, as later in his fiction, he would produce scenes based on the visual stimuli without explaining their meaning, just as all the famous passages involving the narrow attack, the husband's death, the skulls surrounding Kurtz's dwelling in Heart of Darkness. In each of these scenes, the visual element is prominent, with its source masked, like Molly's scarred wrist. The scene is meant to demonstrate Jaggers' power. He controls Molly. She's subservient and dehumanized. This is clear both for Pip and his company and readers. However, readers, as well as Pip at this moment, don't understand the significance of the scarring. It's easy to form a false epistemology and interpret scars as signs of self-victimization, viewing her position, or even suicidal attempts. Yet this would indicate that Molly's weakness, if only emotional. This is contradicted by Jaggers' words about the strength of her wrist. The reader is confused as no explanation at this point is provided. It's much later that the true meaning of the lacerations is decoded, when Wemmick tells Pip Molly's story in chapter 48. Only then does Pip and the reader with him realize why Jaggers mentioned Molly's strength and where the scratches had come from. Obviously, as was the case with Jaggers' soap-scented hands, Pip, in telling the story, withholds information, but in doing so creates a much stronger impression and involves the reader in the active decoding of the images, though the reconfiguration of the initially possibly false interpretations can be done only in hindsight. This type of delayed decoding is endemic to Pip's narration. Unlike in Conrad's narratives, however, the reader doesn't participate in the focalizer's process of decoding the cause of the events, as Pepys told Molly's story by another character, rather than discovering it on his own. However, Pip focuses on the sensory perceptions, and this combination was later modified by Conrad in his Marlowean narratives to more strongly place the reader into the focalizer's consciousness at the time of the events. Yet the story internal character's selectiveness of what is told and what is omitted, and focus on impressions, was already much in use in Great Expectations. Also, stylistic predilections are common to both writers. Wendy Lesser argues that Conrad's irony is an outgrowth of Dickens's complex form of sentimentality. James Walton finds a Dickensian effect in the manner in which Conrad presents physical characteristics with such concentrated detail as to make them seem grotesque in The Secret Agent. Both writers tend to define characters by giving them occupational emblems for names, thus creating their anonymity, but also stressing the role of vocation in defining the self. In Little Dorrit, Myrtle's guests are termed treasurer, bishop, bar, horse guards, physician. In The Secret Agent, we go commissioner and the professor. But also in Heart of Darkness, only two proper names appear. Other characters are identified by their personal relationship to Marlowe or their vocation, like Aunt, the intended, the accountant, the manager, and so on. Linguistically, the style of both writers is characterized by fondness of alliteration and adjectives of quality. A distinctive feature of Dickens's use of English is the pairing of synonymous adjectives joined by the coordinate and. The sentence, "the stream stole languidly and sluggishly on," might easily be attributed to Conrad's Heart of Darkness, but it's taken from The Drunkard's Death, a story from Sketches by Boz, just as the other examples here. Strange and fantastic forms rose to the surface, but his was fruitless, and he returned to his garret when night came on, desolate and weary. This is again very Conrad-like. Dickens not only employed adjectives profusely, but also selected those that would later resurface in Conrad's writing, like "the houses were stained with every indescribable hue." So adjectival insistence was then not only Conrad's deliberate decision to reflect at the stylistic level the concern with language and reality, especially in Heart of Darkness, but also a legacy from reading Dickens. Conrad was exceptionally gifted. The fact that he decided not to write in his native language contributed to his idiosyncratic style and writing method, which is an amalgam of his various readings and his own creativity. Conrad must have had extraordinary memory. He never used dictionaries when he learned English, but memorized phrases and expressions from text he read. His readings shaped his sensitivities to language and its usage, to images painted with words, and to the effects achieved. Given his admiration for Dickens, whose works he reread, the author of Great Expectations can't be overlooked as the fertile source of inspiration for Conrad, who noticed much potential in his predecessors' writing techniques and reworked them in his modernist fiction. Thank you. I tried to keep the timing.
Thank you, Ava. That was fascinating. Really wonderful. Thank you very much indeed. So moving on, we have one last speaker in this session, and that is Daniel Zarbano Garcia, who received his doctorate in 2015 from the University Pablo de Olavide, Seville, for a thesis on Schopenhauer's influence on Conrad's works. He's translated Heart of Darkness into Spanish and has also published on James Joyce. He worked as teaching assistant at Harvard University, and he currently works at a secondary school as a secondary school teacher in Huelva, Spain. Today, he's going to be speaking to us about Conrad, Julio Cortázar, and the short story. The paper is called "We Had a Good Time Discussing Conrad," which seems only fitting. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay, great. If we think about the visionary power of Nostromo, Conrad's impressive novel set in an imaginary Latin American republic, it comes as no surprise the fact that Conrad has been so widely influential among Latin American writers along the 20th century. Jorge Luis Borges considered Conrad among his very favorite writers, and in his poem Fame, he mentioned being a devoted reader of Conrad as one of the distinguishing marks of his identity. Gabriel García Márquez, as is well known, paid tribute to Conrad's tutelary power with an explicit allusion to Konrad Korzeniowski at the end of Love in the Time of Cholera, playing with the idea that he took part in a smuggling business when he was in Colombia. A Colombian writer of a younger generation, Juan Gabriel Vázquez, has translated Heart of Darkness into Spanish and wrote the novel A Secret History of Costaguana, which takes up once more the mysterious Colombian period in Conrad's life. The Peruvian Nobel Prize laureate, Mario Vargas Llosa, published in 2010 The Dream of the Celt, a biographical novel about Roger Casement with unmistakable Conradian overtones. But sorry, I have a, I can see, oh no, sorry. Well, the list of individual authors could be easily expanded, but in what follows, I will focus on another major Latin American writer, one whose interest in Conrad has been less fully appreciated, the Argentine novelist and short story writer Julio Cortázar, best known around the world for his ambitious novel Hopscotch and his fantastic short stories. There are several explicit references to Conrad scattered throughout Cortázar's works, which are indicative of his knowledge of and interest in Conrad's narrative fiction. In chapter 23 of Hopscotch, one of the longest in the novel, we are told that Horacio Oliveira, under a heavy rain, and I quote, got his bearings like a Conrad hero in the bow of the ship. In the narrative context in which it appears, the allusion has a clearly comical effect. In the literature classes Conrad delivered in the University of Berkeley in 1980, to which I will refer again later on, Cortázar mentions Conrad as one of the masters of the short story genre. In the story Diary for a Tale, in the last collection of short stories published by Cortázar, the narrator recalls a supposed meeting with the Argentine writer Adolfo Bioy Casares in Paris, and he comments, "We had a good time discussing Conrad." And finally, Conrad is mentioned in the story Trade Winds, which is one of the stories I am going to focus on now. I quote, "A place where almost everything looked like a color film, waiters and monkeys included, and even the name Trade Winds reminded one of Conrad and Somerset Maugham, the cocktails served in coconuts, the loose shirts, the beach you could walk on after dinner under a moon so merciless that the clouds cast their moving shadows over the sun, to the amazement of people crushed by foul and hazy skies." Trade Winds tells the story of a married couple facing an existential crisis. After many years of marriage, they love each other, but they feel terribly bored. So they decide to go on a journey to Africa, playing a game consisting of pretending that they do not know each other. Their private game establishes some rules, including the possibility of meeting other people. In fact, Mauricio initiates a passionate relationship with Anna, and his wife Vera has sexual encounters with an Italian called Sandro. At the end of the story, when Mauricio and Vera leave Trade Winds, which is the name of their hotel in Kenya, there is an abrupt shift of perspective typical of Cortázar's tales, and the consciousnesses of Mauricio and Vera seem to merge into those of Sandro and Anna. Then the reader finds out that it is a dark game they have been playing, bound to end in the tragic suicide of the participants. The story ends with the resonant words, I quote, "In the darkness," she said, groping for the switch. So, end of quote. So, at the outset of the story, the exotic setting and the descriptive atmosphere are clearly and even explicitly reminiscent of Conrad's fiction. But as it turns out, Conradian darkness seems to emerge at the conclusion of the tale as a metaphysical force engulfing the protagonists in their desperate struggles against fear and ennui. On the other hand, Story with a Background of Water, Relato con un fondo de agua, is an earlier story published in the volume End of the Game, which shares several characteristic features with Trade Winds. To begin with, one of the main characters, an addressee of the narrator of the story, is also named Mauricio, a coincidence which points to further similarities between both stories, including their common Conradian background. This earlier tale also deals with ennui, but instead of exploring the destruction of love by time, as in Trade Winds, it focuses on how the passing of time destroys friendship. In this story, a young man lives isolated on an island in the face of imposing natural surroundings, in a kind of Conradian outpost of progress, where he's becoming gradually insane. Disturbed by a dream in which he sees his own dead body, he ends up killing his friend Lucio, conceived of as a kind of ghostly double of the narrator. The whole story is the confession of Lucio's murder to Mauricio. Though Conrad is not explicitly mentioned, as in Trade Winds, the descriptive atmosphere is even more suggestively reminiscent of Conrad's early fiction, and there are some passages that directly evoke Heart of Darkness. There are numerous references to solitude, silence, and the nightmarish quality of, so to speak, primal nature. For example, I quote a phrase from the story, "Lost in an elemental world." As in Trade Winds, there is an obsessive sense of existential ennui and the futility of life, or as Conrad wrote in Nostromo, the cruel futility of things. And the phrase in the story, the phrase "were it condemnation," referred to the somehow Kurtzian figure of the narrator, evokes Kurtz's loathing condemnation of the universe. But there is a passage in particular in the story which is worth quoting in this regard. Resentful about nothing or the nothingness, about that full nothingness which was haunting us, from which we could not defend ourselves. Compared with this fragment from the ending of Heart of Darkness. In the darkness, in the triumphant darkness from which I could not have defended her, from which I could not even defend myself. Like Trade Winds, Story with a Background of Water opens with a distinctly Conradian atmosphere, develops a theme of existential futility, and ends with a vision of ultimate darkness, akin to that metaphysics of darkness, to echo the term coined by Roussel, which is salient throughout Conrad's entire oeuvre, from his early tales through Heart of Darkness, Nostromo, and The Secret Agent to Victory. A close reading of these Cortázar stories suggests that Conrad does not merely fulfill an atmospheric function, providing a frame of reference for the setting of the stories, but rather that Cortázar engages in a deep reading of Conrad, including a tragic view of humankind and human relationships, and envisioning a metaphysics of darkness with nihilistic implications, at the expense of the more ludic aspects of Cortázar's writings, which are frequently emphasized by critics. As I said before, in the literature classes Cortázar delivered at the University of Berkeley in 1980, he mentioned Conrad as one of the masters of the modern short story. In those lectures, Cortázar also comments on his theoretical understanding of the short story genre, and he compares the perfect short story with the idea of a sphere, which is considered the most perfect geometric form. Then he moves on to a second comparison between the short story and photography. And I quote now from Catherine Silver's translation. Now, because the short story has an internal architectural obligation not to remain open, but rather to close in upon itself like a sphere, and at the same time sustain a kind of vibration that extends to things outside itself, we are going to call that photographic. And it arises from certain characteristics that I think are essential for a story to be memorable or abiding. End of quote. Cortázar then singles out intensity and tension as those characteristics an unforgettable short story must have. And it is in this context, before delving into the modern Latin American short story, that he mentions Conrad as a master of the short story genre, I quote, "I think it's more important to emphasize the short story's internal architecture, what I would also call its dynamic. The fact that a short story contains not only the story, but also a kind of potential, a projection which makes a great story by Conrad or Onetti not only stick in your memory, but also awaken a series of connotations, of mental and psychic openings." Julio Cortázar acknowledges the role that Conrad played as a model for modern Latin American short story writers like Borges, Horacio Quiroga, or Cortázar himself. Short stories like Amy Foster, The Secret Sharer, Il Conde, or The Tale are audaciously modern and memorable in the sense suggested by Cortázar. They tend toward closure while at the same time leaving space for a projection outside the limits of the story and in the reader's minds. Their exquisite ambiguity and intensity, the multiple meanings created by the attention to every word written on the page, awaken those psychic openings Cortázar referred to in his lecture. Cortázar also states that at one point in his writing career, he became aware that being a writer from Latin America meant fundamentally that he had to be a Latin American writer. Now, it is quite remarkable to realize that to a great extent, Conrad can be considered a precursor of Latin American 20th century literature in his own right. Of course, the indirect influence of Conrad on modern Latin American writers needs also to be taken into consideration, most notably through the mediation of North American writers, and especially Faulkner, who has been a protagonist of this conference thanks to the brilliant discussions we heard yesterday and that we will be hearing today. On the other hand, Heart of Darkness and Nostromo in particular explain the pervasive influence of Conrad on Latin American fiction with their themes of human exploitation, tyranny and revolution, and the futility of history. But in this presentation, an attempt has been made to sketch another aspect of the influence of Conrad on modern Latin American literature, namely Conrad as a short story writer, focusing on two short stories by Julio Cortázar in which the presence of Conradian elements are noteworthy. Cortázar is just one among the many Latin American writers who have been, and still are, deeply interested in the works, life, and legend of Joseph Conrad, whose presence in Latin American literature along the 20th century and beyond is just a part of his legacy, testifying to the permanent appeal of his writings and the prophetic power of his vision. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel. That's fantastic. Really interesting, and wonderfully, perfectly on time as well. So thank you to all our speakers for managing their time so effectively. So right, welcome back everybody. So yeah, we have time for questions. If people want to raise their hands or write in the chat box, and I will try to spot hands or just shout out, and yeah, we can discuss these 4 papers.
Yeah, I've got a question.
Go ahead.
Yeah, hi. I think it's referring to Nidesh. I mean, what do you mean by Anthropocene? I'm a bit lost there. Can you just elucidate it?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks so much for that question.
Yeah.
I compressed some information in there and I didn't have time to explain all the terms. Anthropocene is a concept that has come to the foreground of literary studies, but the humanities and all fields, basically. It comes from geology. And it's basically the realization that we are exiting the age of the Holocene, which started with the birth of agriculture and allowed for a period of climatic stability. And there is still debate among geologists whether, you know, when it started, if it's the Industrial Revolution or if it's in the 20th century. But the Anthropocene, as the term says, anthropos, it's an age in which humans act as geological forces on the planet Earth and are changing the planet, specifically the climate, but you can think of the ocean glacification, acidification of the oceans, deforestation, overpopulation, and so on and so forth. So it's a new geological age that is being discussed, especially in environmental studies, but not only. And my claim is that Conrad, even though he was writing before the official kind of denomination of the Anthropocene and in an age which was not as heavily impacted, pays attention to non-human forces. Background is never simply background. A typhoon is never simply a metaphor. It has a physical force, and he is particularly attentive to the interplay between the human and the non-human. And in that sense, he is a writer that is very interesting to read for scholars interested in the Anthropocene.
Okay, thanks. Thanks.
Douglas, yes.
Hello. Thank you very much for all those papers. My question is for Cedric Watts. Thank you. I thought your paper was brilliant. At the end of it, or towards the end of it, after talking for some time about the way that themes precipitate images, you allowed for the possibility that it might actually work the other way around. That is, the images precipitate the themes. And I feel that that actually might be a better way to think about it, because after all, how would we know what the themes were if we did not have the story involving images? So I reckon that the image might come first, and I think that I might support that idea by appealing to the preface to the Nigger of the Narcissus, where he doesn't say, my task, which I'm trying to achieve, is to make you think. He says it's to make you see. And that suggests to me that for Conrad, the image takes precedence. What do you think of that?
I think that's often the case. That's often the case. Typically, the way Lord Jim begins, where we have such a strong impression of that character. And I think Conrad himself said that he often begins with a strong image. And Hoover, Ford, also said this. They began with a strong image, then we go to and fro, developing from that image, from that point. So I think you're right. Often the image generates a theme, though when I was initially beginning with that thought of the spectacles in Nostromo, it did seem to me that was very much like a theme that is generating a particular image.
Can I just briefly follow up? You challenged us on the secret sharer. And that, of course, depends on how you read the story. If you think the secret sharer is about a certain theme, then you're going to choose this or that image.
Yes. What I had in mind was the theme, the concealment of a fugitive, which is obviously enough. And that seems to me to generate the L-shaped arrangement of the captain's suite, which becomes, of course, the L for legate. Neat.
Oh, very good. Very good.
Thank you. Sorry, yes, could we, John, and then Jana, and then after Jana, Anthony. So John, can we start with you?
Yeah. One quick thought about the Dickens. There is arguably an influence on spelling. There's one in Lord Jim. The original spelling of Lord Jim, Conrad spells lapel, L-A-P-P-E-L. Where on earth did he get that spelling from? As far as is known, the only previous example of it being spelt that way is in chapter 14 of Nicholas Nickleby. So that's a possible other inference. My other thought was on the idea of a physical disease having metaphorical extensions is the opposite, I suppose, in the end of The Secret Agent, where the professor is compared to a pestilence in the street. I don't know if there are other examples of people being compared directly with pandemics.
Is that a question, or should I make a comment?
You're welcome to if you'd like to, Ada, yes.
Of course, yeah, thank you. Of course, we can't in any way prove it, but I personally believe that Conrad might have had the so-called photographic memory. So perhaps the idea of this spelling thing comes from that, because if you learn languages without any really like grammar books or dictionaries, you tend to memorize images, also images of words. So maybe that could explain this misspelling in Lord Jim taken from Dickens. But again, we can't prove it in any way. That's just my assumption.
Thanks, Ava. Nidesh, would you like to respond at all?
I don't have anything specific. Maybe can you reformulate the question briefly?
It's just that the professor is regarded as a pestilence in the street. In other words, you have a human being being directly regarded as an epidemic. Of course, you mentioned about the epidemic, and it has a metaphorical extensions. Do you know other examples of human beings being metaphorically likened to epidemics?
Not off the top of my head. I was referring to the shadow line where the epidemic is not metaphorical but literal, and so I was interested in treating in particular the non-human forces. A virus is a non-human force, literally, for the non-human forces that they are, and not metaphorically for something else. So that's why I don't have specifically in mind the kind of metaphorical use at the moment, no.
Furlock does get referred to as passing backwards and forwards across the channel like the flu, of course,
yes.
which,
yes.
yeah, right at the beginning. We have a question which follows up on this from Jana. Are you still there? I know Jana was a bit concerned that how her signal will be. Are you with us still, Jana?
I am here still. We've had some power go in and out. So yes, so my question is for Nidesh, and thank you for all of your panels. They were all very interesting, and I have questions for all of you, but I thought of Nidesh's first. And so I'm really interested in contagion as mimesis. And I was thinking about your suggestion of Conrad's positive answer to negative mimesis, right? And of course, there are different kinds of contagion and mimesis you're speaking of. So political contagion, right? The contagion that Kurtz is able to affect, say with his political speech, that I thought was a very apt comparison to some of our political issues today. Isn't that a kind of social and emotional effect of human relations, right? So it's about, say, in groups and sociological, basically. So I just wondered if, and unlike medical contagion, other than the fact that we're spreading pandemics through not wearing masks and hanging out together, except for us today, of course. But anyway, I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about the solutions to these political contagions, right? Perhaps in Conrad or otherwise. How optimistic can we be about them? Perhaps that's one way to put it.
Right, optimism in Conrad is tricky, but yes, you're absolutely right to point out that in Heart of Darkness we're dealing with an emotional contagion, which is sociological and psychological. And interesting, the term contagion emerged out of crowd psychology. Figures like Gabriel Tarde and Gustave Le Bon in France, who talked about crowds as being affected by emotions in terms that are defined as contagious. And interestingly, the metaphor was taken from Louis Pasteur's discovery of microbes. So that at the origin of the metaphorical use of emotional contagion is indeed a viral contagion. And I think that it's useful to think about the interplay of the use of emotional contagions of political leaders, if we think about the present, and the way they can amplify viral contagion. So the two are distinct, but interrelated, since a pandemic is both a medical and a political problem, as we all see. But on the positive answers, I mean, I don't think solution might be too strong, but I think I align Conrad with a chain of thinkers of mimesis who are profoundly aware that, and mimesis is a broader concept that includes contagion, but also identification, mimicry, impersonation, doubling, and so forth, that is aware that mimesis always cuts both ways. And so that the pathological implications can be balanced by positive form of affects if the models that are at play spread solidarity and communal fellowship. And so in the case of the shadow line, which is the case study for the epidemic contagion that you were mentioning, what I find striking is that after a moment of kind of initial distinction between the captain and the crew, a tale that is very often taken as a kind of a tale of maturation, a psychological tale of individual maturation, reveals that this maturation happens in a specific context that is sociopolitical and medical and viral. And so that the maturation is never only psychological, but is tied to this background, and the background of the outbreak of malaria is crucial for that maturation. So I think that Conrad can help us pay attention to that background, which again is never simply background, but informs and transforms what is in the foreground. And I would say there is hope.
Thanks, Nidesh. We've got 2 more questions, but I think that's all we have time for, sadly. Anthony, you are next, and you had a question, I think, for Daniel.
That's right, for Daniel. You mentioned one of the quotations came from Cortázar's lectures at Berkeley, where he's talking about the pictorial. And many British people know about Cortázar's writing actually from the film Blow Up, which is all about interpreting a photograph and how that gets misinterpreted or whatever. But an interview certainly with Marquez, when he was talking about having been influenced by both Conrad and Virginia Woolf, talks very much about he felt liberated and almost justified because of the way they played with very complicated patterns of time, historical time, and moving across chronologies, breaking down what we may think as ordinary chronologies. For example, in Beginning of Heart of Darkness, when he thinks back about somehow London still, being prehistoric and that sort of thing, but in Nostromo as well. Do you see a tension between Cortázar's tension or interest in the pictorial for the short story and his own Cortázar's playing around with very complicated temporal organization? Or is that a tension, or are they mutual?
Well, thank you for your question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Well, I can.
Thank you very much. Well, you mentioned several very interesting things. For example, Garcia Marquez, who is obviously very influenced both by Conrad and Faulkner. So, well, and also in that case, I've been thinking about an interesting thing. For example, how in Cedric Watts' monograph about the deceptive text, where he discusses brilliantly that balance between the supernatural plots and the realist plots, how Conrad uses that kind of narrative material, the supernatural balancing. That might also have an influence in magical realism, which is, as you know, one of the main currents in Latin American literature. And then what you say about the photographic elements in Cortázar, that story in which Blow Up is based on is in Spanish Las Babas del Diablo. It's called Las Babas del Diablo. And yeah, but also what another interesting thing from my point of view, when Cortázar says that kind of vibration and so on, that I think that phrase, it reminds me what Conrad says in his preface to Heart of Darkness. I don't know if you remember that resonance. I had to leave with that sinister theme, a resonance which might keep the reader And I think that's the kind of that's the thing Cortázar refers to, that vibration, that resonance, which has to, which makes a story memorable or abiding. And even in that phrasing, I think that's a resonance of Conrad's talking about the Heart of Darkness. But anyway, I don't think I'm I'm answering your question, but anyway, thank you very much for it. And
thank you very much.
Thank you.
So we have one last question from Tanya, I think. Thanks, Tanya. Is Tanya, oh, hang on, Tanya, I'll unmute you.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm sorry, I was on mute. My question is for Eva. Thank you very much for bringing us so close, so close to authors that seem so different, and also for showing that Dickens's more sentimental vision is not that far from Conrad's more impersonal style. I was just wondering, Eva, if you have had any experience in translating both authors or any of the two authors into Polish. I mean, I'm not familiar with the translation, with translating Dickens's text, but translating Conrad implies looking at so many different levels, some of them general translation, some of them peculiar to Conrad. The presence of different languages beneath his English, as Polish, Polonisms, Gallicisms, or not to speak about Malay languages. The question of the sentence structure, which is so different, and it is not always purely English, such long sentences and so on and so forth. The very use or misuse of terms. So I was just curious to know, in case you have had any experience in translating or in working on the translation of these two authors, if there is any sort of connection in the approach to translating them, and or if the elements of style you have put together can be of any help in that sense.
Thank you, Tanya. That's a very, very broad question. I myself have not translated Dickens and Conrad, but of course I've worked on translation, and those non-English-like sentences in Conrad are very much Polish-like or French-like, because Polish and French syntax is similar. So what seems odd for English-speaking readers in Conrad, long sentences of very unusual structure, becomes actually very much domesticated in Polish translation. You don't feel any problems in style. I mean, Conrad in Polish reads Polish, and that's one of the biggest problems, because Conrad feels strange or alien to English readers, and in translation he doesn't in Polish. However, there are many, many, many problematic areas in his writing. The fact that he, for instance, in the Nigger of the Narcissus, interposes different languages, so each character speaks actually a different dialect or vernacular, which is characteristic, like of Irish for Belfast, or for Scottish for Archie, or Cockney. This is completely lost. Of course, there are some stylization methods in Polish translations, but really you can't place the vernacular to a particular geographical place. It's somewhat similar with Dickens, in whose novels where Cockney, or short stories where Cockney is used. This is not really recreated. But something which is unusual is this, for instance, this pairing of adjectives for which Conrad was criticized. In many translations, those adjectives are lost. I mean, they are not translated as synonymous adjectives, but only one adjective is used very often, because this accumulation of words is actually treated in Polish as poor style. So there are many problems in translation in this respect.
Thank you so much.
We could talk for hours about that.
Thank you, Eva, and thank you everybody for your questions, and to our speakers again for such really stimulating papers. I think we're taking a short break now. Kim, do you want to tell us what next? But before we do that, can we just say thanks again to all our speakers?
Yeah, thanks everyone. We're going to take a short break, as they say, and it's 15:24 now, so it's going to be quite a short break. If we could start again about 3:30, and our panel will run until 4:45 when we have some questions, and then hopefully people will be prepared with soft drinks, hard drinks, whatever you like, and we can have some virtual drinks at the end and discussion. Okay, see you in 5 minutes. Okay, right, let's start again. It's 3:30. So our first speaker for this panel is Paiwen Clio Cao. I hope I pronounced that properly. And she's an assistant professor at the Department of Foreign Languages and Literature of National Ilan University, Taiwan. Her research speciality lies in Conrad studies, Faulkner studies, and literary modernism. She completed her PhD from National Chengchi University, Taiwan in 2015. She's published articles on modernism and on Conrad in international journals such as CLC Web, Comparative Literature and Culture, The Conradian and Conradiana, and in book series Conrad, Eastern and Western Perspectives, published by Columbia University Press. And Paiwen's paper is The Power Not to, Agamemnian Thoughts in Conrad's Victory and Faulkner's Intruder in the Dust. So I pass over to you.
Thank you, Kim, for introducing me. Hello, everyone. I'm glad to be here, and it's now 10:30 p.m. in Taiwan. It's quite late, but I'm very excited now, and I'm looking forward to have your feedback to my paper. Okay. According to Joseph Conrad's biography of William Faulkner, the American modernist master viewed Conrad as, quote, one of the writers he had loved at 18, end quote. The literary influences have revealed themselves throughout Faulkner's writing career in his special favor of describing the marginalized, the disabled, and the deviant characters. It seems that in representing great humanity as a quote, spirit capable of compassion and sacrifice and endurance, end quote, Faulkner specifically pays attention to the invisible and the voiceless people, such as the working class laborers, the innocent women and children, and the racial minority. The materials for his writing are incorporated in a quote, a life's work in the agony and the sweat of the human spirits, end quote, said Faulkner. While the value of human solidarity embraced by the artist is always mirrored in the, quote, disregarded multitude of the bewildered, the simple, and the voiceless, end quote, observed Conrad. With a view to connecting the two writers' visions of the artistic responsibility to represent the human spirits of solidarity and resilience in the face of pains and sufferings of the hard life, my paper attempts to analyze the characters of peripheral social status in Conrad's Victory and Faulkner's Intruder in the Dust, based on the philosophical thought of the contemporary theorist Julio Agamben. I shall keep an eye on the marginalized but decent female figure, Mrs. Schomburg, in Victory, and the noble but intractable racial author, Lucas, in Intruder in the Dust, in order to spell out the enduring and prevailing force of human beings in their status as the most oppressed and the most marginalized. Both Conrad's Mrs. Schomburg and Faulkner's Lucas are not a typical heroine or hero. One is a snubbed wife of a lower middle class white man in the colonialist. The other is a half-black man of a lower middle-class family related with the plantation owner father. Neither of them belong to the category of white male bourgeois elites. Rather, they move between the binary divide of life and non-life, white and black, rescuer and rescued. Julio Agamben is a productive contemporary philosophy of ethics, political theory, and law. His philosophical thought is mainly based on Walter Benjamin's theorization of history as realized at the dialectical image, or the concept of dialectic at the standstill. This is a philosophical attempt to subvert the Western tradition of binarism by disrupting the hierarchical opposition ingrained in our thoughts and everyday practice as well. The philosophical foundation that underpins Agamben's whole work is a project quote, to render the production of dialectical relations inoperative, attempting to explore and deactivate them in order to make them unworkable, end quote. Inspired by Agamben's dialectical thought with his determination to undermine the hierarchical structure of power, my paper will apply his concepts of inoperativity and impotentiality to rethink the issues of human relationship and judicial justice as represented in Victory and Intruder in the Industry. In most of the critical interpretation of the marginalized character, Mrs. Schomburg in Victory, this seemingly lifeless woman is unanimously characterized by Conrad scholars as redundant part in the novel. Ellen Burton Harrington makes a doubt on Mrs. Schomburg's motive to help Lena out. Nevertheless, she maintains that Conrad, the writer, quote, leaves the possibility open that her assistance is also tinged with compassion, unquote. In Harrington's open-ended rendering of Ms. Schomburg's case and characterization, I am inspired to delve into this wooden figure with more positive or affirmative light. According to Harrington, Conrad employs this dummy figure to indict the, quote, dehumanizing effects of the dominating male desire, end quote. In addition to the indictment of male domination and commodification of women, Mrs. Schomburg has also become the mouthpiece to quote, critique the Victorian and patriarchal idea of marriage itself, end quote. In contrast to Harrington's argument about Ms. Schomburg's demoralization and dehumanization that has induced her with, quote, no impetus to escape on her own behalf, end quote, I would argue that it is this dehumanized and dummy-like features that make a point of Ms. Schomburg's empowerment. Mrs. Schomburg is constantly described as an enthralled idol made of wood whose silence and immobility is accentuated throughout Davison's account. Her image of inaction is set in high relief against her subsequent action to help Lena out. Furthermore, Mrs. Schomburg is referred to as a lifeless, quote, it, an automaton, a very plain dummy with an arrangement for boiling the heat and smiling stupidly now and then, end quote. She seems to be deprived of her humanity to become a mechanism that refers to binary dynamics of Western thought, bordering on action and inaction, humanity and inhumanity, making the anthropological machine inoperative. In her situation as an acute observer and bystander, she is entrusted by Hist to be a go-betweener to contribute to Nina's flight plan. Quote, Mrs. Schomburg's immobility gave her appearance of listening intently, unquote. It is Ms. Schomburg's transcending of inaction to action that has made her potentiality to protect the girl, to fulfill their love, and to render the redemptive victory at last. Mrs. Schomburg's bordering on the two spaces of inaction and action and inaction, in humanity and inhumanity, a third liminal space that enables her to assert her power to resist the hierarchical structure that attempts to pin down marginalized and oppressed people like her. Her power not to has been transformed into a subversive force to confront an anthropological machine's epistemological balance. She has become the triggering force to set whole subsequent events in motion. In the narrator's or implied author's point of view, quote, she is more resourceful than one would give her credit for, unquote. In other words, her power not to do is her choice force to make potentiality of victory for the hero and the heroine. In her appearance of, quote, looking so helpless, so inane, end quote, Mrs. Schomburg is transforming her concealing into revealing, her inaction into action, which is all made possible by her power not to do. Ms. Schomburg's imbecility, indifference, and stability are only a mask to be put on by her own will, while testifies to her power and potentiality not to. Ms. Schomburg was attempting to, quote, conceal her tortures, abject humiliation and terror under her stupid, sad, everlasting grin, which, having been provided for by her nature, was an excellent mask, inasmuch as nothing, not even death itself, perhaps, could tear it away, unquote. At best, Mrs. Schomburg's potentiality not to is the device that resists the chauvinistic and masochistic Schomburg to rescue Lena and Hest, and most importantly, to defend her position as a dignified human being. As Hest has observed, Mrs. Schomburg, quote, was engaged in the task of defending her position in life, end quote, which is, quote, a very respectable task, unquote. With her miraculous force of dissimulation, Ms. Schomburg wields her power not to defend her position as a human, deserved to be treated humanly and with dignity. It is at this point defending her sense of humanity and dignity. Ms. Schomburg's power not to and her force of impotentiality is best linked to Lucas' case in the context of American post-balance cells. Throughout the novel, the silent Lucas Beauchamp is described as, quote, intractable and composed, end quote, or, quote, with an air solitary, independent, end quote, although constantly being named as a Negro or nigger in a young boy's consciousness and as a symbol in a white lawyer's ranks. Lucas exhibits his strength and agency, his power not to undermine white bigotry and the supremacy of the old South. This novel's whole perspective is seen through Millicent's eyes, who once had stereotyped and prejudiced ideas against the racial others in the beginning of the story. The narrative then has become Millicent's journey to quest for his moral conscience in the sense of racial justice. Lucas is a black descendant of the white planter Matt Castling, so that the former has, quote, face pigmented like Negroes, but with a nose high in the bridge and even hooked a little in what looked out, though it or from behind it, not black or white either, not arrogant at all, and not even scornful, just intolerant, inflexible, and composed, unquote. Lucas's impotence, his mixed racial origin, is metaphorical in a way that embodies the dismantling of the anthropological machine in the Western metaphysics based on binary opposition of white and black, good and evil, light and darkness. Lucas' silent, inscrutable, and composed manner carries the potential not to that has unwittingly undermined the power relations of or racial hierarchy for the young white boy, quote, could never give up, now who had debased not merely his manhood, but his whole race. Do I have, how many times do I still have? Is it time? Is the time over?
Sorry, I couldn't find my mute button. You got 2 minutes.
Okay, and then I'll jump to the conclusion part. Sorry. Both Conrad and Faulkner are admirable modernist masters in their concern for the marginalized and the voiceless figures in the society based on binary hierarchy. Their sympathy for those oppressed people is expressed in personal essays and speeches as well as in the works of fiction. In their works discussed in my paper, the two masters leave rooms for a lifeless wife and the salient Negro, respectively. They give those characters positive forces not through strong voice, but through their power not to. For Agamben, there's always something unsaid, included in the said, a casual hung up between possibility and impossibility. This state of exception propels us to think outside the fixed pattern, the potentiality immanent in the ability, the power not to. When applied to literary works, we as readers are encouraged to see the unseen, to hear the unheard, and to tease out the power not to embedded in the text. Being the marginal figures in their respective conditions, Ms. Schomburg and Lucas Beauchamp wield their power not to defend their positions as human beings and undermine the dominant structure of patriarchy and racism, respectively. In Agamben's philosophy, what is unsaid in the works of an art and literature indicates the possibility of development of the work itself. The unsaid and unsayable part of the text therefore carries the weight to deconstruct and tear apart the whole fabric of literary tapestry. In Conrad's Victory, the marginal character Mrs. Schomburg serves as the unsaid possibility and potentiality, whose underestimated help for the protagonist to facilitate the final moral message of victory of the story. In Faulkner's Intruder in the Indus, Lucas Beauchamp starts from the margin and then occupies the center of the narrative and hones the consciousness of the white boyish Malaysian to become the moral guidance of the Southern community. Although Conrad's dummy like Mrs. Schomburg disappears or is dismissed at the midpoint of the narrative, she serves as the groundwork underpinning the hero and heroine's moral victory. By contrast, Faulkner, in following the model set by his modernist predecessor, places the inscrutable Negro at the heart of the novel's mystery, rendering him the pillar of the Southern community's moral construction and consolidation. While the boy dominates the consciousness of the narrative, the older black man gives the last sentence, thus the final say of the narrative's conscience. The peripheral figure's power not to remains in potential, giving potential impacts on the readers of their times and beyond. Thank you for your patient listening. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Maria, I'm really sorry. I first hiccup of the conference, I very rudely went straight on to Pai Wen, but thank you very much, Pai Wen, for starting that panel off. And Maria Luigia Dionisio, we've got you up next. So Maria, big apologies. I'm very sorry that
no worries, no worries.
In there. So let me introduce you. So Maria Luigia Dionisio has completed a PhD in human sciences and is now a postdoctoral research fellow in the Department of Literature, Arts and Social Sciences at Gabriele D'Annunzio University, Chieti, Pescara. So her research focuses on late Victorian women poets, classicism and science. Her forthcoming monograph, Percorsi di Poesia Vittoriana, considers the work of 3 women poets in the light of late 19th century ideas of female nature. She also works as a translator and has published Italian translations of contemporary novels, biographies, and essays. So Maria Luigia, your paper is What a Horrid Mess, Interpretation and Survival in Folk Reminiscence. So over to you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I'm just starting my presentation. I hope you can see it. Okay. Here we are. Okay, can you see it? Okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
So I'm going to start my timer as well. Okay, this paper considers Joseph Conrad's story Folk Reminiscence in the light of Roland Barthes' theory of codes, which, as is known, explores the structure of literary texts by bringing attention to the threads of meaning or paradigms actually shape it, the voices woven into it. My brief contribution will focus on one of the 5 codes, the hermeneutic, that is one of the possible, and here I'm quoting Roland Barthes, one of the possible avenues of meaning which can be arranged to form various landscapes, articulating a topos or a grid through which the text passes. I initially intended to put together at least 2 intersecting threads, but then I have laid emphasis on one of them for reasons of time as well as relevance. The hermeneutic code, or the voice of truth, offers significant insights into Conrad text, not because it provides its ultimate meaning or true interpretation, the explication de texte, which is, as Barth warns us, a tiring no less than vain pursuit, but in that it brings to the foreground the complexity of a work of art. In a recent seminar, this July, Giovanni Bottiroli has reminded us that a structuralist perspective through which he looked at Heart of Darkness makes us see deeper and more intensely into a literary work by rendering it more intelligible and disclosing something new. So let us plunge into the hermeneutic code, which for Barth has to do with interpretation, questions, and delayed answers. From its very title, Conrad's short story signals the centrality of folk, and like Sarrazin, Balzac's novella Barth famously analyzes in his essay As Said, 1970, already thematizes the main enigma, the subject of the chief hermeneutics, namely folk himself. Equally important, the second part of the title, A Reminiscence, hints at the leading role of the narrator, what we will see and know, along with the internal audience of the story, is what a homodiegetic first narrator will see and choose to tell us, his interpretation of the events and characters involved. The preeminence, as well as the elusiveness of interpretation in folk, has already received some critical attention. What I will argue here is that interpretation is literally vital. For the narrator, understanding and adapting to the context he is living in and coping with, quote, the dark plot, unquote, he's caught up in as a young captain in an unknown Oriental port, proves absolutely necessary in order to escape the threat of absurdity. His attempts to make sense out of apparent nonsense become a real and effective strategy of survival. The idea of survival pervades the whole text and is closely imbricated above all with Darwinian science in a multiplicity of references to the theories of natural and sexual selection. And here we are entering what Barth terms the referential code, or the voice of science, of culture. I will not pursue this issue on which many critics have dwelt. I will just draw attention to a key episode, the game or the pretended game at cards between folk and the narrator. The scene is undoubtedly crucial in the proeretic sequence in the Code of Actions. More crucially, however, it intersects the hermeneutic code in that it introduces some fundamental, though partial, disclosures. While talking with folk and at the same time pretending to play at cards with him, the narrator begins to read the world and people around him with different eyes. His moral order is destabilized, and after a crisis of confidence, which brings him on the verge of despair, he is now, and here I'm quoting Joel Keller, ripe for conversion and corruption, unquote, for growth and disillusionment at once. It is at this stage that the narrator, the young captain, learns how to play the great game and survive. You will remember that the narrator is a young captain at his first experience of command. He's been having some problems with a Scandinavian sailor named Falk, who is thought to be his rival for the possession of a very fascinating German girl, Herman's niece. And Falk believes this love tale himself, thus refuses to tow the captain's ship, while he, the captain, realizes to his great consternation that he has become the protagonist of a romantic triangle in spite of himself. Just before the episode of the game at cards, we find him in a coffee room, utterly miserable. Then unexpectedly, Falk appears at the doorstep. That's the opportunity he was waiting for. I must have a talk with you, he says, and then he proposes to sit in the veranda and pretend to play. Later we read, we went through the motions of what might have been a game of écarté. And we were not gambling, but it was a game. In working out his idea of narration and of hermeneutic narrative in particular, Barthes often uses the metaphor of game and survival. A narrative, he says, is a game of forces, a balance of tensions that must be kept alive, and it is a hermeneutic code that grants its survival by setting up what he calls a dilatory area between questions and answers. In other words, it contrasts the inevitable flow and therefore death of the discourse by activating the paradoxical static dynamics of the text. Hence, in folk reminiscence, interpretation and partial disclosures until the final nomination, folk's cannibalism, are essential to the survival of both narrator and narration. However, it should not be forgotten that in this story, misinterpretation is no less prominent than interpretation. For a start, the game at cards, as we know, never takes place. It is staged by the narrator so as to deceive the onlookers. That is by no means the only example of a false story circulating in a text. In fact, the reminiscence opens with a misleading resume by the first narrator who is about to tell his audience about an absurd episode of his youth concerning only me, my enemy folk, and my friend Herman. The attentional triangle he outlines at the onset is then replicated in the epilogue when we learn that after 5 years, that's what we read, there was a tale still going about the town of a certain folk, owner of a tug who had won his wife at cards from the captain of an English ship. Early in the narrative, a similar tale of romantic rivalry had been spreading throughout the port, much to the dismay of the young captain, whose attempt at rational explanation at the time was hopelessly baffled. With respect to the hermeneutic sequence, the moment in which he realizes that he is trapped in a horrid mess and is desperate to know the meaning of this infernal nonsense corresponds to what Barthes calls jamming, the admitted impossibility to solve a problem that is to reconstitute the metonymic chain. Metonymic and synecdochal processes underlie the functioning of the hermeneutic code according to Rice and Schoeffer's reading of Barthes' theory of codes, inasmuch as, very broadly speaking, it revolves around questions of why and who. Metonymy and other related figures have been a subject of long-running debates in rhetoric, semiotics, etc. What is important to remark here is that the basic structure of the hermeneutic code consists of questions and answers, enigmas and delayed solutions. Then, if the structure is this one, then in Conrad's story, many enigmas are either proposed or formulated or just thematized, but actually never solved. Ultimately, the possibility of definite answers and reliable narratives is undermined. While eventually the chief enigma is unknotted and the taboo word cannibal, like the castrato in Barthes' example, is finally uttered after a series of proleptic hints, partial and euphemistic disclosures, yet many questions remain unanswered. First among them, who is Herman's niece, the nameless and speechless woman who has attracted so much critical attention? But also words, gazes, gestures, actions that the narrator is unable to explain, not even after many years. And it is perhaps, as I have argued, his most successful strategy of adaptation and survival, renouncing to some extent the idea of, as he says, getting the whole story. In this respect, it might be interesting, I think, to delve into how these underlying ideas of uncertainty, unknowability, and instability are conveyed through metonymic images. There are several examples in the text, but I will just mention a particularly significant one, the empty violin case the young captain finds on board his ship. In fact, it is not empty, only it does not contain a violin, but some bills, vouchers, a photograph, and an account book. In short, a collection of apparently unconnected objects, fragments pointing to a whole, to a truth which will never be recovered. The story of the former captain will remain as the Chinaman who steals the narrator's saving, completely unscrutable. Truth and lies coexist in an uneasy interplay between order and disorder. In Barth's view, expectations of order and closure underlie the hermeneutic narrative, for, he says, expectation is a disorder and the basic condition for truth. Disorder, the critic claims, is created by adding elements, multiplying questions. It is supplementary, whereas order is complementary. Not much differently, the reading process and a structuralist analysis seek order out of disorder, out of too much sense, as Gilles Deleuze would say. To conclude, by focusing attention on the voice of truth in Conrad's folk reminiscence, the importance as well as the complexity and elusiveness of interpretation have emerged. Here I would like to suggest, without further articulating the suggestion, that in folk, what Deleuze calls the empty case, the ex-object or the perpetuum mobile, one of the most elusive and intriguing ideas of structuralist analysis, is, in inverted commas, the true story itself. After all, as Balzac's Sarrazin was not, Barth insists, a story about a castrato, folk is not just a story about a cannibal, but, in Barth's words, the story of a force, the narrative, for what is told is the telling. I have started with Roland Barthes, and I will end by his idea of the pensive text, with which he concludes his analysis of the Balzacian novella. The pensive text, he argues, though it has come to a close, and here I'm quoting, still seems to be keeping in reserve some ultimate meaning. We, like Barthes, would like to ask folk, what are you thinking about? But the text does not reply, giving meaning its last closure, suspension. That is why I believe Conrad's stories, like Calvino's classics, can always be reread, because they will always have something to say and new avenues of meaning to disclose. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marie-Louise, and thank you very much for sticking to time. Perfect. Okay, so now we're moving on to our next speaker, who is William Atkinson, who I think we all know. So William is professor in the English department at Appalachian State University, North Carolina, where he teaches world literature and mythology with a principal scholarly interest in animal studies. His publications include essays on Conrad, Synge and Beckett, the most recent being Yes Again, Achebe and Heart of Darkness, updating the horror in the Conradian, autumn 2018. So William, are you there and are you ready?
Yes, I'm here. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Good. Before I start, I should say that this paper is absolutely stewed in Agamben, just much like, but I don't mention his name, so I'm just being honest about that. So, Almayer's monkeys. Few would dispute that animals are not humans, but Conrad likes to highlight humans who are as much non-human as they are human, and animals that seem to be drifting into humanness. In these indeterminate spaces, an entity's ontology as human or animal is uncertain. This uncertainty finally renders inoperative the whole process of distinguishing the human animal from the non-human animal, thus undercutting a key area of humanist thinking. In this paper, I will take up position in this indeterminate space, the better to examine the foggy hinterlands on either side of the putative frontier. In Almayer's Folly, both Nina and her mother share the benefit of a Western education, and neither are slaves, yet savage is a regular marker attached to both of them. The woman whom Lingard later had married to Almayer, he found on the deck of a prow that he had taken by force. but he never knew that she had been fighting as fiercely as any of the pirate crew against him and his followers. The Sula boat is set alight, and she watched as all she held dear on earth, after her own savage manner, drift away. The text is saying that her way of holding people dear is not quite like that of the reader. Similar, but not identical. She's represented as savage, both in the sense of being violent and of being primitive. Lingard has her educated at a convent in Samarang. In spite of 4 years with the nuns, she remains a Sula pirate's a Sula pirate's child at every level, bred in blood and brutality, a savage. Lingard hopes to do better with his daughter Nina. He had good friends in Singapore, the Vinks, who would take care of her and have her taught properly. But early in the novel, Nina unexpectedly returns to Zambia. Captain Ford, the master of the steamer in which she returns, explains why she left so precipitately. You know, Caspar, it is deucedly awkward to have a half-caste girl in the house. There's such a lot of fools about. There was that young fellow from the bank who used to ride to the Vink bungalow early and late. That old woman, Mrs. Vink, thought it was for that Emma of hers. When she found out what he wanted exactly, there was a row, I can tell you. She would not have Nina not an hour longer in the house. Evidently, Mrs. Vink's response was on her Emma's behalf. Not that there's any reason to believe that Emma and her sister objected to their mother's action. Those two Vink girls are no better than dressed up monkeys. They slighted her. You can't make her white. It's no use swearing at me, you can't. Captain Ford's judgment on the Vink sisters seems to present no obvious puzzles, but closer attention reveals ambiguities and conundrums. Does the sentence about there being no better than dressed up monkeys tell us that the sisters are no more attractive or intelligent than monkeys? And they low after them as human. Or is the statement predicated upon the assumption that monkeys are mean, and therefore the sisters' slighting of Nina is entirely congruent with their pre-existing simian natures? Or does their slighting of Nina justify a comparison with monkeys, that they are as mean as monkeys? This last reading is characteristic of a discourse that begins from the assumption that animals are the degraded other. But the novel's actual monkey shows himself to be a most virtuous character. So why should we assume that bad behavior, jealousy and racism in the case of the Vink girls, is characteristic of monkeys? The Vink sisters' jealous reaction is characteristically human. The Nation of 17th of October 1895 carried a review of Almayer's Folly, a novel in which the only white man of importance is a Dutch trader, while all the women are Malays or half-castes, does not promise much entertainment. The very white Vink girls were perhaps too brief an act to provide much entertainment. The writer concludes with a complaint that Borneo is a fine field for the study of monkeys, not men. The Bookman's reviewer finds more to enjoy, but observes, human nature has not in Mr. Conrad so powerful a painter as have the wood, the river, the eastern sky by night and day, implying that human nature deserves as much attention, if not more, than natural nature. These are very different judgments, but the same anthropocentric assumptions underpin them both. That human nature, white human nature, I suppose, is the only subject worthy of a novelist's serious attention. But Mrs. Almayer, the Vink sisters, and Almayer's actual monkey problematize this assumption. We first encounter Jack in chapter 1. A heap of common mats lay in one corner, with an old hammock slung diagonally across. In the other corner, his head wrapped in a piece of old calico, huddled into a shapeless heap, slept a Malay, one of Almayer's domestic slaves. My people, he used to call them. A numerous and representative assembly of moths were holding high revels round the lamp of the spirit, in the spirited music of swarming mosquitoes. Under the palm leaf thatch, lizards raced on the beams, calling softly. A monkey chained to one of the veranda supports, retired for the night under the eaves, peered and grinned at Almayer as it swung to one of the bamboo roof sticks and caused a shower of dust and bits of dried leaves to settle on the shabby table. The floor was uneven, with many withered plants and dried earth scattered about. A general air of squalid neglect pervaded the place. Great red stains on the floor and walls testified to frequent and indiscriminate beetle nut chewing. The scene includes a man, moths, mosquitoes, lizards, and a monkey. The verbs, reveling, racing, calling, peering, and grinning, are words that generally indicate human activities, so the music of the mosquitoes and the skylarking of the moths are clearly anthropomorphic metaphors. Animals, such as the lizards, seldom make sounds without some sort of communicative intention, but there is no reason to assume that they are attempting to communicate with Almea. The lizards are lizards in and of themselves. They need not be symbols of anything else. Their lives and stories are entirely independent of the novel. They have wandered in from some other text. They're there for color. The same applies to the moths in their coleopterous revelry, the musical mosquitoes, and the sleeping slave. The monkey, his name is Jack, on the other hand, has a relationship with Almea. His grin is evidently a communication with Almea. The monkey is a character in the story, and the passage is entirely typical of the novel in that it declines to privilege human beings. Jack does not appear again in the story until the last chapter. Nina and Dine have left Zambia forever, and Almea has returned, meaning to forget Nina entirely. In the house which Almea entered through the back veranda, the only living thing that met his eyes was his small monkey, which, hungry and unnoticed for the last 2 days, began to cry and complain in monkey language as soon as it caught sight of the familiar face. Almea soothed it with a few words and ordered Ali to bring some bananas. When the bananas came, they had their breakfast together, both hungry, both eating greedily and showering the skins round them recklessly in the trusting silence of perfect friendship. It might be argued that Jack is there to show how far Almea has fallen. His only friend is a monkey. He eats what a monkey eats, and in the same manner. He is now at the level of the monkey. This meaning requires that human beings be privileged, that monkeys be the negative to the human positive. The problem is to what extent the novel presents a clear division between the human and the non-human, with Jack and Almea discard the banana skins on the floor, which is stained with beetle juice. They may toss trash where they sit, but it is the other human beings who spit beetle onto the floor of their dwelling. Jack even addresses his friend in monkey language, one among a number of languages spoken in the novel. Perhaps Almea understands it. The Nation's reviewer might at this point be regarded as validated. Where is the difference between the monkey and the humans? Nowhere, comes the reply. So they're all monkeys, monkeys not men. And the reviewer supported this position by the observation that all of the women are Malay or half-caste, presumably just one notch up from simians. He starts from an anthropocentric position, that white human beings have absolute primacy and ultimate value in nature. But with the full humanity of even the ultra-white Mrs. Vink in question, the divide between human and animal becomes increasingly fuzzy. In the sisters' case, we are looking from the human side to the non-human. With Jack, we are looking at the same divide from the non-human side. Thus, the distinction is less a clear divide than a zone of indeterminacy, which determines, or should I say indetermines, the human and the non-human. When Captain Ford makes his monthly stop at Zambia, he finds that Almea has retreated to the darkest rooms of the folly. The monkey, Conrad writes, was always there to receive and introduce Ford. The little animal seemed to have taken complete charge of its master, and whenever it wished for his presence on the veranda, it would tug perseveringly at his jacket until Almea obediently came out into the sunshine, which he seemed to dislike so much. There is nothing particularly strange about such behavior. Monkeys are highly social creatures, and one raised from infancy by Almea would develop a close relationship with him. Nor should we assume that all monkeys would behave in the same way. Species, but is one of a number of possible behavior sets. The same could be said of any of the characters in the novel. Indeed, Jack manifests more character development than several of the minor figures in the narrative, Ali or Jim Eng, for example. Jack's relationship with Almea demonstrates a reversal of hierarchy. Almea has abandoned his dominant executive position. His identity, his position in the hierarchy of Zambia, is initially a function of his relationship with Lingard, the Rajat, the king of the sea. And from the beginning, Almea regarded himself as the principal trader in Zambia. That was his identity, and he meant it to be temporary. His plan was to make a lot of money and then leave to live large in Amsterdam. His position is slowly whittled away by Lakamba and Abdullah. Almea's movement down the hierarchy is manifest in the decay of the Lingard and Company buildings. When Dain Marula and Nina abandon him, Almeyer's projected future at last disappears like an opened fist. He has no place at all in the Sambir hierarchy, nor in any other. Jack, quite possibly with considerable reluctance, takes responsibility in their relationship, an unexpected but plausible development. The Nation's reviewer assumes a clear separation between the human and the animal. In his reading, the monkey taking the role of major domo demonstrates that Almeyer has fallen from humankind itself, since he is led by a simian. The final stage of his collapse is marked by the arrival at the folly of Jim Eng, who supplies Almeyer with opium. Opium is an entirely human weakness, and it brings about his death. Jack was doing his best to bring Almeyer out from the inner darknesses of the folly and into the sunshine. Jim Eng provides the Dutchman with the drug, thereby slamming the door on the darkness. Jim Eng and Jack are polar opposites. One enables Almeyer's final collapse, the other struggles against it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, William. That was a lovely paper. Thank you. Okay, we're coming to the very last paper of this conference now. And I think our last speaker needs very little introduction. David Mulry, who gained his PhD from the University of Kent in Canterbury, is Professor of English at the College of Coastal Georgia and webmaster for the Joseph Conrad Society of America. He's published on political fiction, gender and colonialism, and manuscript and typescript revisions in Conrad, with recent articles on Conrad's Heart of Darkness, The Brute, Wyndham Lewis and Sylvia Plath. His recent book, Conrad Among the Anarchists, examined manuscript revisions of The Secret Agent and its political milieu. That's Palgrave, 2016. And his new book, Terrorism in the Victorian and Edwardian Novel, examines terrorism in British and American genre fiction from 1871 to 1914. And David's paper is entitled A Taste for Silence, The Failure of Retreat in Conrad's Wilderness. So David, if you're there, we can hand over to you.
I am. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Loud.
My internet is cycling in and out. I hope that you don't get too much of a taste for silence here, but we'll see if I can scrape 15 minutes. One of the more pervasive and intriguing tropes of Conrad's fiction is the flight of his major characters into wildernesses of land or sea. Seen via the self-mythologizing of Conrad's own biographical narrative, one might consider this a quixotic fascination for adventure. The appeal of the mysterious Congo for Marlowe, for example, who confesses he is absorbed by the immense snake uncoiled with its head in the sea, its body at rest curving afar over a vast country, and its tail lost in the depths of the land. It's surely the tail that's lost that appeals to Marlowe, for in following it, he might become lost in pursuit of the interminable miles of silence. But it would be a mistake to read Conrad for quixotic narratives of conquest and adventure. His tales are not stories of exploration, but of retreat. Sambaran is described by Schomburg in Victory as the retreat of that villainous Swede. Patchusan is described by Marlowe as his and Stein's precious scheme for Jim's retreat. These are not narratives of discovery, adventure, or wonder, that they are actual and existential flights from a kind of wound, the Weltschmerz, what Stein and Lord Jim calls a heart pain, a world pain. Jim and Heist in Victory retreat to blank spaces on the map in an attempt to escape and, quote, bind themselves to silence. But what is it that they're fleeing? The answer to that is complicated. It's localized and specific, of course. Jim's breach of trust and duty aboard the Patna triggers his initial flight. Heist's paternal legacy of pessimism and skepticism renders him aloof and alone. But we're talking in generalities too. If these characters retreat into wildernesses, what is it that they leave behind? Surely it is society, community, civilization, if we may use such a loaded term. In symbolic terms, it is the great city. A seemingly unsolvable problem, the great city was a pervasive fascination for fin de siècle authors, as population growth soared and urban expansion seemed to stretch the metropolis beyond the organic and the natural into something sinister and pathological. Conrad, of course, foregrounded this in Heart of Darkness with the mournful gloom brooding motionless over London, and wrote about it implicitly in his London novel, The Secret Agent, explicitly in his author's note. Then the vision of an enormous town presented itself, of a monstrous town, more populous than some continents, and in its man-made might, as if indifferent to heaven's frowns and smiles, a cruel devourer of the world's light. There was darkness enough to bury 5 millions of lives. The 19th century city grew in part because of the movement of rural populations into urban centres during industrial expansion, something that Raymond Williams charts across centuries in the country and the city. But the expansion is magnified by immigration pressures too, as we heard discussed yesterday in Tanya Zuli's fascinating talk on the 1905 Aliens Act, as economic immigrants from across Europe and beyond leapt into the unknown, like Yanko Gural in Amy Foster, to improve their lot in life. But population grew too because of reprisals against radical political populations across Europe and Russia, as states displaced agitators and protesters. Russian Jews sought refuge from the violence of the pogroms. Communards in France fled reprisals for the Paris uprising. Anarchists and revolutionaries point to these uprootings to note particular migrations of radicals. In A Girl Among the Anarchists, for example, by Isabel Meredith, or the Rossetti sisters, the narrator notes in a chapter titled A Foreign Invasion the arrival of some Italians fresh from their native country because it was the year of the coercion laws in Italy, and the anarchists and socialists were fleeing in large numbers from the clutches of the law. Whether fleeing poverty, oppression, or harsh reprisals, the result in sanctuary countries and cities like London, New York, and Chicago was rapid urban growth and the kinds of population increases that intensified labor anxieties, stoked fears of the collapse of cultural homogeneity and identity, heightened anxiety about policing and surveillance, but also threatened public health just by virtue of rapid population shifts. Some of this may feel familiar today. Arnold White, in The Problems of a Great City in 1887, uses pollution as a marker for the changes. Imagination is needed, he writes, to believe that once upon a time the Thames flowed clear at the Tower, or that our country was ever known as Merry England. The Thames was a sore point, for the health crisis of overpopulation and poor infrastructure had come to a noisome head just a few decades earlier in the Great Stink of 1858, when the smell of the polluted Thames became unbearable. One newspaper account notes, "Whoso once inhales the stink can never forget it, and may count himself lucky he lived to remember it," and describes the river as the receptacle of the excreta of near 3 millions of persons. Dwellings, factories, laundries, streets pour their liquid and solid refuse into its current. A navy of active steamboats employ their paddle wheels in stirring the mixture, and the sun, great agent of fermentation, sets the mass into a work. The Great Stink helped create the impetus of modernization of London's sewage system, but its presence was a malign reminder of the stubborn difficulty of infrastructure problems that seemed altogether more difficult than the conquest of the globe to Victorian reform initiatives. Anxieties about what was called miasma, foul-smelling air as a disease vector, seemed justified by cholera and diphtheria outbreaks in London, though it would later be replaced by germ theory. While miasma theory was wrong in its essentials, polluted water was the disease vector, not the putrid air, anxieties about the health implications of living in such a befouled environment as cities grew were not misplaced. It's worth noting also that the urban poor bore the brunt of extreme conditions, being less able to escape their environment, with predictable results. Whether a response to prevailing economic conditions, to industrialization and urbanization, or to more subtle millenarian fears as the Victorian era ended, it's a pervasive anxiety that repeats in many of the novels of social change from the period that wargame the failure of capitalism and concomitant radical or revolutionary threats. These thought experiments repeatedly evoke the image of the volcano, Krakatoa having demonstrated its destructive power across Indonesia in 1883. The anarchist novels anticipate seismic structural forces of change. Some sudden fury may open the volcano and civilization will meet its death struggle, we read in Miss Warden's Hero, 1891. Are we on the eve of great changes or are we not? Is all this going to burst forth some fine morning and set the world on fire? From the Princess Casamassa in 1886. We are sitting upon the edge of a volcano which may flare up at any moment. Or if the gentlemen prefer it, we're walking about in the powder magazine, carelessly smoking our pipes. The decline and fall of the British Empire in 1891. Now we seem to have strayed, or perhaps in the spirit of Yale's discussion yesterday, drifted a long way from our beginning. Jim and Heist and Conrad's novels of retreat. But I suggest that we haven't at all. Genre novels of terror and revolution play out conventionally in a few ways. The anarchist is defeated and the threat is contained. The anarchist is successful and a utopian society emerges from the ashes. Or the anarchist is successful, society is destroyed, chaos ensues, and the protagonist flees the ashes of civilization. The latter version, a potent blend of the invasion genre made popular by George Chesney's The Battle of Dorking and immediate copycat versions like The Commune in London or 30 Years Hence, both of those from 1871, by Samuel Bracebridge Hemming, and the novel of retreat made popular by the sensational novella The Doom of the Great City, being the narrative of a survivor written AD 1942, actually 1880, by William Delisle Hay, were sensational publishing hits. The formula is repeated in anarchist fiction. Caesar's Column, 1890, an American novel, charts the collapse of New York and great cities everywhere through revolution, records a flight to safety and a fresh start in the mountains of Uganda. The Decline and Fall of the British Empire records the fall of the British Empire from an account of an Australian visitor to the ruins of what was once Great Britain in the year 2990. Delisle Hay's Doom of the Great City plays off of miasma theory with a first-person account of a poisonous smog that wipes out the entire London population, some 4 million casualties. The narrator in Delisle Hay's epistolary novella addresses his grandchildren, warning them of the dangers of an urban population explosion, technological excess, and some 60 years after the event, he resides with his family in rural New Zealand, where the air is still sweet-scented. And that is still true today, apparently. There is a nod to prevailing anxieties of imperial decline in the location, since the historian and essayist Thomas Babington Macaulay warned in his discussion of Leopold von Ranke's History of the Popes in 1840 that Catholicism had outlived much and might outlive British imperial dominance too, imagining a future where, quote, some traveller from New Zealand shall in the midst of a vast solitude take his stand on a broken arch of London Bridge to sketch the ruins of St. Paul's. The New Zealander he imagined was no doubt a Maori, emerging as part of the rise and fall of cycles of imperial dominance and decline, rather than in Delisle Hay's novella, a British refugee fleeing for safety, and thus by extension a colonial offshoot of empire. The thread of the decay of civilization in Macaulay's image was a popular, often referenced and graphic vision of the threat of decline. It clearly struck a chord with Victorian audiences and millennial fears of degeneration. And I propose that this is part of Conrad's pessimistic vision. Heist, of course, exists in a landscape dominated by the threat of a volcano. It broods through much of the early narrative and is even the beacon by which he is discovered by Mr. Jones. Perhaps surprisingly, Jim is menaced by the image as well, himself a product of rural migration to the city.
he looks out across an industrial landscape aboard his training ship to see, quote, factory chimneys, which rose perpendicular against a grimy sky, each slender like a pencil and belching out smoke like a volcano. The image returns with destabilizing menace when Gentleman Brown is attacked on his approach to Pachysand. The hill squirted fire and noise into the night like a little volcano. Both Jim and Heist attempt to navigate powerful forces of capital, but they are precipitated in the crisis by their collapse. Heist's coal company, Jim's rusting steamer with its human cargo, the Patna. Stein in Conrad's Lord Jim observes that man has no place in nature. Sometimes it seems to me that man is come where he is not wanted, where there is no place for him. Why should he run about here and there, making a great noise about himself, talking about the stars, disturbing the blades of grass? In some ways, the comment is unfair. Both Heist and Jim find moments of repose in their secret places, but the society they flee finds them where they are hidden. In this way, Conrad's narrative of retreat is more intriguing and skeptical than those of anarchist genre fiction. Conrad does not end with retreat, but begins with it. And rather than being able to relax in their Edenic pre-industrial idylls, they discover what Williams notes in his The Country and the City, that the apparent dichotomy between the city and what is ostensibly outside of it is false. The country participates in and bolsters the world that creates the city. It can't exist without it. And when the world comes to visit Heist and Jim, there can only be one outcome. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Ooh, bit of interference then. Thank you very much. I think that was a great paper to end these 3 days on. So we've got time for questions. If anybody would like to ask a question of any of our panelists, you can either put something in the chat, or if you raise your hand, I'll try and look for you.
Question for David. Hello?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
David, do you think it's possible to argue that The Secret Agent is in a way a parody of the Doom of the Great City motif, that nothing, there is that overall destruction in so many of those novels, and it doesn't happen in The Secret Agent. There's the threat of the contagion at the end, but essentially London is too big to reduce to rubble.
It doesn't happen except in sort of the microcosmic level in terms of the annihilation of individuals that we've seen sort of progress, and in some respects that's largely the hook and the hinge that drives a lot of anarchist novels. We care about the city falling because we care about a particular character collapsing. So, I mean, yes, I would agree with you. I don't think that the Secret Agent is a Doom of the Great City novel. I think it's more playful. It's more sardonic. But I think elements of it are there. Clever elements of it are in play, and Conrad sort of manipulates them in interesting ways.
Yeah, great, good, thanks.
We've actually got a question from Joshua Bernstein in the chat, and it's a question for William Atkinson. He says, I think your presentation was excellent, as were the others, and I think you're clearly right that Conrad rejects the traditional human-animal distinction and even inverts the traditional hierarchy in Almea. But I'm wondering if the challenge Conrad poses is to humanism or to hierarchy itself. That is, I wonder if he's criticizing the supposed superiority of humans, or whether he's actually criticizing the very notion of superiority, or perhaps power, or something else. I say this because he also seems to be poking fun at colonialism, maleness, whiteness, etc. So, William, I don't know, you can probably read it in the chat anyway.
Yeah, I've already read it. It's a very interesting question. In a sense, it's not particularly important to me what he was doing. He was certainly questioning hierarchies. My tendency is to take what I can from a text, and even if Conrad didn't care a damn about animals, the texts allows me to extend the questioning, to extend it. If he questions hierarchies, then he is presumably questioning all hierarchies. And since the human-animal hierarchy is the one I'm interested in at the moment, then I'll take what I can get from it. Does that answer your question? With any satisfaction?
Joshua, do you want to come back?
Yeah, that does answer it. I mean, we could say more, but I want to let others speak too. So.
Okay.
Well, Cedric has a question, Kim.
Okay, Cedric. You there, Cedric?
Yes, I'm there. I again had a question for William. I thought it was an excellent paper, but one thing I disagreed with, we were told that Nina and Dane abandoned Almayer. I think it's the other way around. He has the chance of starting a new life with them. He's happy. He could be happy to go with them, but racial prejudice stops him. So in a sense, it's his racial prejudice that makes Almayer abandon Nina and Dane, I think.
Yeah, thank you, Cedric. I was looking at the paper last night and I was looking at that sentence and thinking, is this quite right? Possibly not. However, if you asked Almayer who abandoned whom, he'd probably say they abandoned me, although I grant you from our point of view, it's probably your way around.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Yes, thank you.
There's a question for Ahmed Hanani in the chat, which is to Paiwen. And he says, had you considered those moments in Conrad and Faulkner when the marginalized and the oppressed refuse the power not to, and instead resort to moments of great violence against their oppressors? I'm thinking especially of Wash Jones and Absalom and Winnie and the Secret Agent, both in relation to Agamben's concept of homo sacer. Paiwen, I don't know if you want to respond to that.
Oh, yes, thank you for the question. For the concept of homo sacer, I have only read one of the book in Agamben's homo sacer series, as is Remnants of Auschwitz. But in that book, it doesn't touch very much about the apparent violence of the marginalized people against the oppressors. I remember that the book says about the importance of the mix of subjectification and the desubjectification of the oppressed people in their force to undermine the binary hierarchy of subjectification and the desubjectification to this force of undermine the Western binarism. They resort to this undermining force against their oppressor. And I think Agamben's, in my paper, I focus on Agamben's concept of the power not to. And I think this is not a literal meaning of really not to do something. It is the liminal space of between the border between action and inaction. And it's about what am I going to say? It's like I give some example, like the Occupy movement, Occupy Wall Street movement of the 2011, or Gandhi's nonviolent movement against the British ruler. It's the force to have a silent protest against the oppressor. It's not really not to do anything, but they're forced to resort to the crack between the action and inaction, between the force to do and not to do, in this liminal space that they can have their protest force to be heard or to be seen. This is what I can say for now. I hope I have answered your question. Thank you.
Iwan.
Kim, can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, Michaela. Did you have a question?
Yes, I have a question for Maria Luigia. Maria Luigia, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Nice paper. But I'd like to know if you see a connection between Falk and Franklin expedition to the North Pole with the two ships, the Terror and the Erebus, in 1845, considering that it was alluded that Franklin's crew had apparently behaved in forms of cannibalism. In passing, have you noticed that graphically the name Falk is inside Franklin in a sort of cannibalism with words?
Okay, yes, thank you for your question. Actually, there are many sources for this expedition and for the episode of cannibalism. And there was also some other people asking me in the private chat. So I would say that there are several sources. And I actually haven't dealt with it because I was focusing on some other aspects, but also because there are really some very interesting studies, especially if I can say by Kim Solomons, about this, this source that you've just mentioned, and even others. So I think that I have to delve into it. But Kim and others can tell you much better than I can. And yes, for the name Falk, I've noticed what you've just said, and even that there's a kind of animalism in his name. So he's described with similes, dealing with animals and with materiality, with the material world, and even his name has some animality in it, and also some German references. So there's a lot to say about this very short story, but very, very complex and interesting.
Yeah. Thank you, Maria Luigia.
Thank you.
May I ask a question, madam?
Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you, Kim Simons, for giving me the opportunity to ask a question. My question is for Maria, madam, Maria Luigia. That you have mentioned, and my question is to everyone even, that you often mention that Falk's cannibalism, but can we refer to this just one incident of eating human flesh under pressure? Cannibalism, by cannibalism is a system, is a culture who practice it deliberately. But since Falk was forced, he had no other alternatives but to eat the flesh for his survival. So can we call it cannibalism, or can we call it just an instance which a man had to do under pressure? This is one question. Another, you referred to your paper that Falk's cannibalism functions as a kind of survival for the narration and the narrator. How is it so? Thank you.
Okay, so as for the first part of your question, I couldn't hear well the last part, sorry, but as for the first part, I can tell you that yes, that's precisely the interpretation that has been given to cannibalism in this short story. So it was a kind of necessity probably, because there's nothing that could be done. What we get in this short story is Falk's tale narrated by the narrator. So there's a kind of manipulation of the events. And what we get is really, yes, it was a necessity. Falk says that he has eaten the flesh of other people on the ship, on board the ship, because he couldn't do anything else. So it's just the law of survival. So I wanted to survive. What do you want me to do? he says to the narrator, to the captain, there was absolutely nothing else I could do. If I didn't, if I didn't do it, I would have died on the ship. So yes, that's absolutely necessary, and it's the law of survival. But I didn't touch on this this problem, this issue, because it has been debated a lot, and it's really, really complex for 15 minutes. So yes, I think we can continue the conversation in the chat, perhaps, or even later if you want. Yeah, thanks for your question anyway.
There's a question from Jana Giles to David. I'm wondering if you can expand on the degeneration trope in your new book on the anarchist novel or elsewhere, specifically if you locate that concept in an older, more historical trajectory beyond fin de siècle discourse.
Hi, Jana. I'm not sure how much broader you mean or intend there, but I do treat it more substantially. I spend some time looking at atavistic reversion tropes in the depiction of anarchists, and especially in the way that those are linked to sort of a misappropriation of Darwinian ideas as part of that sort of 19th century discussion of race. In fact, from this talk, I had cut, and unfortunately because of time, some reference to William's got a really interesting paper that he did on victory, rather like the sort of concept that he showed us today, with this place between the human and the animal, and he goes into some detail looking at victory in those terms, in terms of figures who are perceived to be human there, and figures who are perceived to be sort of savage, animalistic, more sort of devolved. So the answer is yes. Not really outside of the 19th century, though.
Thank you. Robert, did you?
I just wanted to throw into that discussion a novel which also lies behind Victory, which is Wells's The Island of Dr. Moreau, which plays again on that ambiguity between the border between the human animal and other animals. There's a lot of ambiguity about which way the creatures are being converted.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm going to pass over to Lawrence now, just for some closing words, and I'm sure that he will be asking us all to perhaps have a glass and to raise a glass to
Indeed.
the Conrad community. So
yeah, well, for once in my very voluble career, I'm gobsmacked. This has been such a wonderful conference. It's astonishing. Very sad for many of us that the Pescara conference couldn't go through. With any luck, it'll go through next year. But there is this wonderful community to coming here, and we've had those tropes of poisoning, of ecological destruction, and so on and so on. But it struck me that here we are in a topological space without distance, or in fact, it's more than that. It's as though we see the two places at once, not in the terrible way of the end of Heart of Darkness, but in the sense that we have perhaps the only conference paper that's ever been delivered to the sound of cowbells. We've got, the terrible worries for those in Louisiana and so on, for what's going on there. We've got just about every continent covered except Antarctica, and of course, if you see Falk as a connection with Antarctica, that's that too. So enormous thanks to Kim first of all, for coming up with the idea, a brilliant idea. And second of all, to conduct this conference so well, so carefully, and so on. And a special thank you too, as well, to Mary Burgoyne and her work behind the scenes on technical issues and so on. We've had background and foreground, we've had resonance, we've had all kinds of things that fascinate current scholarships. Well, I happen to have here a bottle. I'm not advocating consumption of alcohol in all directions, but I'm pouring a glass here. I'll raise it up. There we go. And going in there is dry white vermouth, which was Joseph's favorite aperitif. And call on you all to use an Italian word for a brindisi, or a toast in English, and Iechydau hi pob in Welsh. So good health to everybody. Thanks so much for joining in.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Zdravie.
Zdravie.
I may drink water.
Yamas.
Well done, yes.
Bon santé.
Post.
Bon santé,
Yes.
salut.
Polish coffee mug.
Angela.
How goes it, Jana?
Me?
Yes, yeah.
Oh, thank you. Well, actually, the wind and the rain are battering on the windows at the moment.
Really? Yeah.
Yeah. And part of the backyard fence came down.
Yeah.
About an hour ago. So, but you know, I just replaced the roof literally about 2 weeks ago. So it's holding up.
And it's holding up.
So yeah, and that's good because it had a little leak before. So I'm glad I took care of that in a timely manner. But thank you for asking. So far the house is here, and but it's a bit kind of stormy out there. Yeah. Thank you.
Madam, can I ask a question to Robert Hampson?
Hello.
Dear sir, can I ask a question to you?
Yes, go on.
Yes, you have used the phrase the reader trap. The reader trap.
Yep.
Remember. Could you please explain it a bit? How is a reader trapped? In what sense?
It's a term that comes out of Joyce studies. Hugh Kenner introduced it into Joyce studies a long time ago, and I used it in relation to Heart of Darkness. So, for example, when Marlowe says, when Marlowe is talking about the idea behind it and so on, and then he breaks off, what matters is the idea behind it. So you can set up and bow down before. The reader trap is that we think that there is an idea because we think that's why he stopped. But he knows how the story ends. And he knows that metaphor of saying you can set up and bow down before is what Kurtz has done. So that we don't know that is the memory that's excited for him. So the reader trap there is that we are directed in one way by the idea of there being some idea. And a lot of criticism has then spent a lot of time trying to work out what the idea is. But in fact, he breaks off there, not because of the idea, but because of the metaphor he's produced and the kind of horror of the metaphor he's produced. So the reader trap then is something where on a first reading we take it one way, well we're being misdirected by Conrad, and that on a second reading we realize that something else was going on.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Studies of Heart of Darkness then should have two forms. There should be the first reading, the naive reading. There should be the second reading, the knowledgeable reading. But what is the true reading? Something in between the two?
Yes.
So every reading is a preparation for the next reading.
I remember a comment by Roland Barthes somewhere who said only children and academics read a story more than once.
Children. Why do children read it more than once, though, Anthony?
think we're the only ones who have time.
Yeah. That's true.
Or get paid.
Well, you know, Singleton reads the same book all over and over again. He's not an academic. He's a very impressive person. But
yeah. I'd like to continue perhaps a little bit the last session, Kim, by asking Pei Wen a question or making a comment, if I may.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I found your topic really fascinating, Pei Wen. I mean, the power not to, fantastic. The first thought that came to mind is, of course, Bartleby the scrivener, who prefers not to. Does that Gumben talk about him, or do you include him in your paper? Bartleby, you know, who says he prefers not to participate in the capitalist game. It's actually about Wall Street, because that's what it's all about. And it connects with what you said about Occupy Wall Street. It's a kind of a passive, a non-violent form of resistance to the system, which is what he represents, Bartleby. He says he prefers not to. He doesn't say anything else. He just says, I prefer not to. Have you thought about that?
Oh yeah, thank you, Nick, for your comments and your suggestion about Bartleby. Yes, in my the version of my full paper, I mentioned Bartleby because Agamben also wrote about the Melville's Bartleby in his article about the power not to, and he says it's a prototype of the power not to, that kind of force against the oppressor. It's he traces this concept back to Aristotle's work, and then in the modern day is the image of Bartleby. He can embody this kind of power not to. I prefer not to. He repeatedly said this to his boss, which signifies the force of capitalism, or such as capitalism and the commercialism, such as Wall Street represent. And I didn't notice that I had the connection between the Occupy Wall Street movement and the Bartleby's Wall Street working environment until you said this. I think that's very valuable. I think I can add into my paper. Thank you very much, Nick.
I want just to let you know there is actually an essay about Bartleby in relation to Occupy Wall Street that I read a while ago. I can email it to you if you'd like, maybe if that would be helpful.
Oh, thank you very much, Ami.
No problem.
There's also an element of despair in both Bartleby's resistance, if you like, and Mrs. Schomburg's, because Bartleby has reached his limits, and his final kind of resistance is this phrase, I would prefer not to. Like Mrs. Schomburg, she's been kind of bullied all her married life by this man, and she's basically developed this defense at the end, which is a kind of combination of immobility, you know, which is fantastic. I mean, immobility in Conrad, right? Immobility is like, it's just an incredible concept, you know, like what's behind the immobility, you know, what's hidden behind, what action is the immobility hiding. But they both have an element of despair in their responses, both Bartleby and Mrs. Schomburg.
Are you asking me a question?
No, it's not a question. No, it's just a
okay, just comment. Okay, thank you for your suggestion.
To go back to the question of multiple readings of Conrad, I recently came across at the back of my bookcase the first Conrad story that I ever came across.
The Black Knight or Honest Politics.
Classics Illustrated.
Yes.
Lord Jim, look at that wonderful picture on the front. So that obviously formed my approach to Conrad for the rest of my career.
Yeah, thinking of multiple readings, the experience with my children is that for them, there seems to be something reassuring in knowing what happens in the story. a certain form of mastery and control.
Yes.
And in the case of us academics, it's perhaps the opposite, in the sense that we discover in Conrad's tales shady areas that work as strange mirrors onto the present and allow us in a way to reflect on the present, even though, of course, Conrad was writing in a different period. But
Yes.
we mentioned epidemics, we mentioned politics, and the human and the non-human was a big topic. And so I find it both reassuring and disquieting to see that so much is there already.
Yes.
I think there's a point as well, is that if someone says to me, oh, Beethoven's Fifth Symphony's on the radio, I don't say, oh, I've heard that. When I went to the Louvre, I didn't think, oh, I've seen the Lonelies, I don't really see that again. So why does literature, which is also great art, why do you only read it once? Isn't it like Beethoven's Fifth Symphony on the moment? Great literature, you want to enjoy it again?
This reminds me of some anecdotes about Joyce and Faulkner. Joyce said, I've sort of my one ambition in life is to make all of the academics and all of my readers read me for the rest of their lives. And Faulkner said, somebody asked him, you know, I've read your books 3 times, what am I supposed to do, because I don't understand any of them? And he said to him, well, read it 4 times. So it's just sort of, if you keep on reading them, of course they're going to be immortal, because they're never going to go away. And that attests to even to Conrad, we're still here because we keep reading him. So in that way, they are immortal.
I understand. I don't knowingly have any children, but I understand that if you read a story that they know well, but slip in mistakes, young children want to correct the mistakes. And I don't know if they hover between complete uncertainty and a desire for uncertainty, or to correct. I've got no idea, but it struck me as quite intriguing that they're so attentive to what they think they know.
To extrapolate from my own experience.
Or they will actually finish the sentences for you.
Yes.
If you just stop reading half a sentence in the middle of the sentence, the child will continue the sentence because he or she knows it by heart. Yeah. So definitely will.
Yeah.
It's a question of rhythm. The books that I read obsessively over and over again when I was a child and read to my children, the whole business was re-inhabiting the same rhythm.
Oh, right.
So the one that immediately occurs to me is Beatrix Potter, whom Catherine will know as a near neighbour, and the wonderful, nasty Tale of Mr. Todd. My brother and I used to go chanting, and I was about 5 years old, I suppose, round the table. And then he poured the cup of tea all over Mr. Todd. That rhythm.
Yeah.
And that's why the Just So stories are great literature.
Yes.
Yeah.
But isn't there also on that subject, Hugh? I mean, in Conrad's own, I mean, he read his children's books to his children. He read things over and over again. He read his children's books. He was found reciting Edward Lear by visitors in the house. You know, he was immersed himself back in childhood reading through his own children, especially John.
By the way, adjectival insistence was mentioned a couple of times. This is Leavis's phrase. You know, the more I read Heart of Darkness, the less adjectival insistence I find, because the polysyllabic privative terms seem to be justified by Marlowe's state of unknowingness. He's trying to express that clearly. It's defined clearly.
Yeah, absolutely. And all those adjectives that Conrad uses in Heart of Darkness are on purpose. Yes. They're not there just because he likes adjectives. They are very meaningful at the thematic level.
That's right. He's not waffling. He's being precise in specifying uncertainties.
It's interesting to listen to some of these tales. I've listened to Conrad texts on all There's a Branagh reading of Heart of Darkness. And there are some textual changes that I object to. But I think Branagh's reading is superb. And it's interesting because you see sort of someone else takes a directorial role in sort of mediating the text for you, and you're read too, and I find that a fascinating way to get a different insight on the text.
Am I right in remembering that Conrad's father translated Shakespeare into Polish?
The Two Gentlemen of Verona.
Yeah.
Would his father have read to him the English? Do you know? I mean, I've got no idea. Whether he heard English before he could understand it.
I don't think so. From what I know, all the readings at his home were in Polish. They read Polish poetry together. Conrad was made by his father to read the translation of Dickens's, but in Polish, right?
Yeah.
Not in English. No. So actually, Conrad presumably didn't have any contact with English, with spoken English, before he was 21.
I'm just partly interested in this, but my mother was German, and she used to read us bedtime stories in German, which when we were very little kids, we couldn't understand. But she read the story, but then she would translate roughly what it was about. And what was really lovely was the actual sound of the words without knowing what the Dickens was being talked about. So there was a funny kind of discrepancy between sound and meaning, if you like.
Yeah, all like childhood reading, as far as I understand, in Conrad's home was in Polish. So when he was a child, he was exposed to French because he learned French from early childhood, but not English. So he wouldn't know the sound of English. That's why it's so fascinating that he uses so many. Well, we had a discussion with William privately that he actually uses alliteration a lot in his works, because alliteration was not something common in Polish literature, neither in poetry nor in prose at the time when he was a child. So he wouldn't have been exposed to alliteration when he was a child.
May I share something to the panel? I have been trying to learn this language, this English language, since I was a boy of 9 years old in my school. So it has been almost 35 years. Yet, I think that I have not been able to learn this language properly. So how could Conrad, without any academic study of the language, dare to write fiction in English? That is really a puzzle to us. Even today, our Bangladeshi students have been struggling very, very hard to learn this language. Although they start learning it from class 1 or even from baby, still they are facing the difficulty of learning this language. But how could he, without an academic study? It is really a miracle, we think,
because
in Bangladesh.
He was a reader. He was a reader. That's how you learn a language, when you're reading it over and over, especially good literature. This is Helen's department, because he was just a bibliophile. He ate books. So that's how you master a language.
Yes, sir. But we have been also reading. Many people read, and we have read a lot about this language. About we have read a lot of English literature, and we think of writing something. But when we sit to write in English, we find that something is missing in us. Something is missing in us. We can't grapple, or we can't get get at the.
I think it's actually the other way around. That Conrad is one of the great writers of English,
Yes.
And that's partly to do with his Polish sense of cadence. And he read all kinds of things. He read a lot of English poetry, he read Shakespeare, he read Anthony Trollope, but he also read things like newspapers.
Yeah.
So he picks up the different registers of English. I mean, to the end of his life, he had trouble with some pronunciations in English. But that's not the point. He knows that it's the rhythms, it's the cadences, it's the ability to make these marvelous sentences. I mean, ideally love Thomas Hardy, but you spend a couple of days reading Hardy and then read Conrad, and you hear a very different kind of voice. Whether it's quotation marks English or not, I don't know. I think it's enriched English, if you like.
That sounds like.
But it's English ruined by the new Cambridge edition, which repeatedly removes punctuation, which was necessary to the rhythm and the cadences of Conrad's language.
I think there's another thing, though, which is that he kind of had to, in order to survive, so he had to learn English because he's sailing on a ship. And if you don't communicate clearly and effectively, you put your life at risk and the lives of others.
Yes.
And as soon as your life depends on it, whether it's your livelihood as a writer or your livelihood as a sailor and communicating, you make it work because what else are you going to do? And what's interesting is when you look at the letters, he clearly struggled. Like, he didn't find it easy to write novels. It kind of drove him to distraction, but that was his one source of income later in his life. And he made as much as he could out of it by selling his manuscripts and all the rest of it, not just kind of being a writer that got published. He needed that because that was how he supported his family. And when that's all you've got, whether on board a ship or as a writer, you kind of
in his early career, he had to understand commands from the officers. And then in his later career, he has to make the crew understand what he's saying.
I spent 2 years in the Navy. At the end of it, I was told off by the foreman of the garage where I worked because of my foul language. I said I didn't know, I was swearing. I said after 2 years in the Navy, just unconscious. So I'm amazed that Conrad's English wasn't ruined by his years at sea.
I think you've got to remember, of course, we're not just talking any Fred, Dick or Harry in the street. We are talking someone who was a genius. I mean, I know of Joseph Conrad. Another person I think of is the guardian of the Baha'i faith, Shoghi Effendi. Now, when you read Shoghi Effendi, you have to reach for your dictionary. But English was his third language as well. When you reach Conrad, you have to reach for the dictionary. They do a proper job of learning the language. But of course, they're not just, they are, both of them were geniuses in their way. They had a complete aptitude for language.
It's interesting thinking about Conrad's efforts with Malay, because there are two opposing views, as you no doubt know, that the one view is that Conrad mastered Malay, and that's a lot of people are regarded as having mastered Malay because there's this misapprehension that Malay is a terribly simple language, though it does have a relatively simple grammatical structure compared with, say, English. But no language is simple. And so there is the one view that Conrad, yes, mastered Malay, but the much more likely view is that he had very considerable difficulty with it. And of course, he didn't have very long in Southeast Asia to learn it. But he had sort of shipboard Malay, the words he needed to act as a merchant marine officer. But there have been some really extraordinary tales about Conrad's mastery of Malay, which you wonder if they were partly generated by people's amazement at his mastery of English. I mean, it's often puzzled me that, but I don't think he probably wasn't particularly good at Malay. But it's an interesting comparison given what he managed to achieve with English.
If I make a point, with English, he wasn't learning like we are learning English at schools. That's for Mark. He was immersed, and this immersion in English was the point, because he had no other possibilities to communicate in English when he was in England for understanding. With Malay, he actually asked for Malay English dictionaries when he was writing his fiction because he wasn't sure about certain words and he wanted to make sure that he was correct. So the exposure to Malay was not long enough for him to have mastered it.
Yeah.
The fact that he wrote in his letters that he sort of asked for English Malay dictionaries would like testify to the idea that he did not master this language, right?
Yeah.
Well, I
Anyway,
was trying, I
sorry,
spent 3 or 4 years learning Dutch when I was about 55. And I must say it was a bit more difficult than when I was learning, you know, French and German, like many of us did in England in those days as a teenager. And I often felt, you know, that I really wished I'd got Conrad's, I think there is some sort of natural ability, because all I have for learning languages, having no great ear for language, for pronunciation or anything, is application. You know, I can apply myself to learning 20 words a day, and I can do that very dutifully, and I get through it and can pass exams. But I think there's a real gift with Conrad, because he not only was able to use the language, but master it to a level, you know, which is really quite remarkable. You know, however much he read newspapers and books in English and fine poetry and everything else, it is still amazing that it had the outcome it did. It is very unlikely to have happened, I think.
Let's not forget that. Oh, sorry, go on.
In 1975, I met an old lady who'd spoken to Conrad in 1923. I said, "What do you talk about?" She said, "I don't remember, but his Polish accent was so thick, he was hard to understand anyway." Conrad in 1923.
Yeah.
Let's
not. In bilingualism or multilingualism studies, there is this critical age hypothesis, according to which you can master the pronunciation only until the age of 6, 7. If you start learning the language later, you will never be able to speak with the like native pronunciation. And Conrad is here a perfect case, because he started to learn much later, but he was a prodigy, because he could not like go on over this critical age hypothesis. He could not master the pronunciation, but the way he mastered the grammar and vocabulary is unparalleled, actually. Perhaps maybe Nabokov would be in a similar so these two writers would be like absolutely exceptional in terms of multilingualism, and then the application of the learned language in a literary sense. So,
can I share something? Because most of you are native speakers, right? But as teachers of English, we always say to our pupils, there are 4 skills, right? Listening, speaking, writing, and reading. And you can master 1 or 2 or 3 or 4. An example, the first novel was Youth, translated in Slovenian by a very known Slovenian poet in 1940. He translated Shakespeare as well. He had no knowledge of English, and his translation of Shakespeare's sonnets is still the best in Slovenia up till now, right? But if somebody knocked on his door and said good morning, he wouldn't understand. So this is what we're talking about. Yeah.
Incredible. And let's not forget that the whole business of French being Conrad's second language. And I mean, he could speak French. He certainly could read French quite young, and he was totally immersed in a fully French environment in Marseille on ships. and in the city for 4 years. And he allegedly still spoke, according to Ford, he still spoke with a strong southern accent in French. His French is nearly perfect, but it's not completely. And his written French has some oddities in it. But that, you know, so we mustn't forget the French in the middle of it all, and that massive influence of stylistic influence of Maupassant and of Flaubert on his English.
I met a student who had been a student at Ted Sanderson's school, and he'd been introduced to Conrad. He was an Italian-American who'd been brought up in France, and they had a conversation together in French, and he said that Conrad's French was perfect, except for a very slight southern accent. So it fits with what you were saying about Ford.
And Conrad also knew German and Russian sufficiently well to make jokes in those two languages. But
and send telegrams.
Yes.
I think that the more languages he learned at a sufficiently young age informed the next languages. So there's a kind of accumulation of linguistic skill, and I think there's also a kind of intelligence, linguistic intelligence, which is I think very applicable here. But going back to what Lawrence said about the rhythm of the language, I think this is the key to being a good writer as opposed to being a good speaker of a language, is actually the rhythm of the sentences and the paragraphs. I think in this respect, Conrad is absolutely a genius, and as well as any others. But in this respect, he felt, and I think he talks about the rhythm of the sentence, rhythm of sentences. He does talk about this as if the style of the sentence is more important than what the sentence is actually saying. Just going back to what Anthony was saying, his mother, reading him German stories before he could understand German. It's the sound of the language which is as powerful as the meaning of the language. And Conrad, I think, pays as much importance to the sound of the language as to the meaning of what he's writing.
I mean, when Ford sent him first edition of The Good Soldier, Conrad said, I haven't read it yet because I was working on something new, and your cadences would interrupt mine.
Absolutely.
Another couple of multilingual writers to think of are Pessoa, the Portuguese poet, who had this alter ego as a South African English speaker, and Beckett. Very often comes up in discussions of this kind of multilingualism.
I was thinking Pessoa, Lawrence, actually with David's paper, because of the way that Pessoa writes as, I've forgotten, not as Pessoa, but as one of his kind of patronyms. And he writes this series of poems about the Duddon, but from Barrow, where he's supposed to be an engineer in the shipyards there. So there's this kind of interesting setting himself on the kind of in this industrial landscape, but kind of writing back to Wordsworth in really interesting ways.
One of the things I learned from that conference in Cape Town a long time ago is that in some of the townships, there were people who could understand 6 or 7 languages, and including ones from different linguistic groups in South Africa. And that was a matter of survival, I'm sure, but also of community, if you like, that ability to go from one language to another.
Could I ask from Andrew a question? Would, at the time that Conrad was traveling in the Malayan archipelago, he wouldn't have been able to read the script, would he? But would, as sometimes one sees in India or somewhere, you may see street signs or something in both the local language and in English. Would there have been something equivalent to that in Malaysia, in the archipelago? Would there be written English or Dutch or something on, I don't know, hotel signs or something like that? Do you have any idea?
Sorry, so do you mean in Southeast Asia, was there English visible in signs?
Well,
and so on?
I'm just wondering whether, I assume Conrad would never have been able to read the script, a written script.
What, the Malay script?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. He wouldn't know it because it was still at that time. Well, it was in Jawi script, which is not readable to
I don't know enough about
to us, to an English person who only, yeah. But there were also, you know, the Romanization of Malay script had got underway. I don't know the answer. That's a very interesting question.
Because Catherine made a good point about maybe he had, you know, he was learning English, as it were, in order to, you know, to sail his ships and stuff. But, you know, whether you can get around, in fact, Bart wrote a whole book on, I think it's called Empire of the Signs, when he travels to Japan and can't read a thing. So he's intrigued by signs that aren't, for him, meaningful. And I wonder what the situation would have been in Java or somewhere.
Well, I mean, he was mostly based in Singapore, where things were written in English.
In English, okay.
And my feeling is I'm sorry, I'm jumping in a bit maybe on Andrew here, but
No.
my feeling is from his, that his travels around Java were to places like Semarang and Surabaya and so on, and up the Borneo coast. Well, there wouldn't actually be all that much print culture apart from the Dutch colonial newspapers there anyway. And he didn't go to other parts that we would call now Malaysia. I mean, he didn't go up to Penang or Kota Baru or Sarawak or any of those places at all. I think that, and I don't think he could read the Dutch colonial press. He knew the titles. He knew the Rotterdam Courant, which was delivered to Piet van Dyck's house by Captain Wally and the Safala, for example. He knew there were these newspapers, but I don't think he could read them. Anyway, that's
around the cities and streets. I mean, when you look at old photographs, it's really interesting. It's very clear that there were lots of different languages and scripts being used to mark hotels, mark traders. So, and in some of those buildings, they would have been using multiple scripts and multiple languages. And particularly in international ports and so on, those people would be, you know, you sometimes have shops with multiple scripts being used in the same place. And certainly different languages would have been spoken in them because that was the nature of trade there. And the same for the hotels and other things. That's really clear in the images. And also what's interesting is that clearly from quite early on, the end of the 19th, I mean, certainly in the end of the 19th century in places like Hong Kong, scripts are being used specifically for tourism as well. So the way that things are being reflected for Anglophone and kind of a kind of Romanized script audience is sort of there already for tourism.
And of course, there's a bit of segregation by ethnic group too. So if you consider the kind of boarding house that Pedro ended up in, you know, I think that's likely to have been in one language and not the same language as the E&O in Penang, which is, I don't know if any of you have been there, but the E&O is a very old, you know, it's one of the Sarkis brothers hotels. It's an absolutely fabulous place. And they have a very proud photograph in the lobby of people who have stayed there, including Conrad, and which is, of course, nonsense. And when I was there, I said to Anne, my wife, I said, I really ought to go and have a word with the manager so they can correct this. And she said, you've been doing too much academic study, just give it a rest.
Well, the Raffles in Singapore has a little museum, and it also claims that Conrad stayed there, which we know he definitely didn't.
Yeah.
It wasn't even built there.
Sounds like Queen Elizabeth I, who visited every pub in England.
Well, I'm going to sign off because I know that my daughter's just made me some chickpea soup. But I will leave I'll leave it open. So I'll stop the recording, and you can all carry on for as long as you like, until you're.
Thanks for everything, Kim.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Yeah.
I've made.
Excellent job, Kim.
Yeah. No, excellent job all round to everybody.
Yeah.
It's
I'm
fabulous.
just wondering if Robert's still here.
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, you're still here.
Yeah.
Let me make you co-host, Robert.
Oh.
I think I'm still co-host as well, Kim.
Co-host, Catherine, yeah. Okay.
Although I have no idea what that means I can do, but
Me neither. Me neither.
Means if people start saying something that's annoying you, you can just mute them. So if you don't agree, just mute.
Okay, Madam, may I say something to Hugh Epstein?
Yes.
Indeed.
Dear Sir, Hugh Epstein.
Hello.
When I was an honors student in my university, I wrote to you via email, and you sent me the book, the Oxford Companion to Joseph Conrad. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And I was supposed to pay you, but you said that okay, have the book on the society.
The book on the society, yes. Payment. The idea of payment is long gone by, I think.
Yeah. No, yes, but at last you actually gave me the book. You said that have the book on the society, right? So I'm grateful to you, and I've got the opportunity at last to say you thank you. And I had a long desire to see you, and this program arranged by Kim Simons has given me the opportunity. I have read many of your books, Anthony Fothergill, Cedric Watts. Those books are in my possession. Lawrence Davis' article, Robert Hampson's Cross-Cultural Encounters, and Conrad, Betrayal and Identity. And many of you have shaped my ideas. And I have also kept each of your books and articles in the seminal library of our Department of English, University of Rajshahi in Bangladesh. Right. So hope to organize an international conference in Bangladesh where I would like to invite you all if you can come up there. So thank you all. Thank you everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you.
Yeah, I think our payment is that you joined our conference.
Yeah.
Thank you, man.
Payment enough.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to sign off.
Okay.
Do you remember this book, Hugh Epstein?
Yes, there it is.
There it is. That's
Yeah.
the company.
Yes.
Right, I will sign off.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, John.
Look forward to more such meetings. Dear Kim.
Yeah.
Thank you.
See you all. Bye-bye.
See you all.
Bye now.
Bye. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Helen.
Bye.
Signed off? No, I haven't.
Bye.
Could I ask a very last question? I don't know who to now, whether Kim or Mary. Will it be, I think Mary said that we would be getting some of the questions that came through on the chat line printed up. Can we assume we can contact whoever we want to send it on email? Is that fair enough?
I think so. So I know that Kim sent round an email that included quite a lot of us beforehand with the links. So I guess you'd have most people's email
Okay,
address.
right, that way, yeah. Okay, fine.
I'm not quite sure whether there'll then be a kind of contact list after this that's kind of more of the people who
Yeah,
registered since
okay,
then.
yeah.
Because
It'd
I
be
think
nice
there
to
are more
continue
people
some of the
registered than
conversation.
Kim emailed last week.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Cheerio, all of you, and thanks very much.
Bye, Anthony.
Take care.
You too.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
I'd like to thank Mary also while she's still here for all the work she's done in the background.
Indeed.
So
Yes.
thank you, Mary, for all that.
Thank you, Mary.
Oh, cheers, everybody. Seems like there are quite, I don't know.
We're down to single figures now, aren't we?
I know, we're on a single page anyway.
Yeah.
I kind of forgot that the next conference will be in Poland. So
when is it?
Oh, I think Ava's link has just dropped, actually. I think she was trying to tell us and then the link went. Oh, maybe is she back? Hi, Ava. Great.
When is it?
When is the next conference?
Hi. I was just trying to ask whether people were coming to Poland next year for the conference.
What time of year?
I think Professor Krajka from Lublin is doing it in July.
Okay.
But I'm not sure how the dates would be with perhaps Pescara thing, if Pescara is still...
I guess, do we know what the dates are yet for Poland?
I know the dates, but I've forgotten. It would take me too much time to find the email.
Yeah. No, don't worry. I guess we can... Are they advertised online already?
I think at least I got an invitation. Perhaps we should sort of... maybe I should find the poster and send it to the society to advertise it.
Please.
That'd be good. That'd be great.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll make note of it because I know that you know, Professor Krajka has retired.
Yeah.
And only one person from the Conrad unit is left in Lublin, and she's organizing this conference, and she sent me the invitation, but I'm not sure whether she advertised it in the society. So I'll send you the information as soon as I can find it, okay?
Thank you.
That'd be brilliant.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ava.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then we can also try and kind of make sure we coordinate as far as possible with plans for Pescara as well.
Okay. Because that would be a pity, you know, if some people wanted to go to both to the Polish conference and to the Italian conference, to the international one. So
we'll try and see if we can coordinate if we can.
Yeah, because this is the... Okay. Thanks very much for this.
Thanks, Ava.
Thank you. Bye.
I can see you, Robert. You are very much into politics. You're very, very active on Facebook, which I'm a novice to. So I admire your. I don't know how much time you have during the 24 hours a day to do all the work you do, plus be so active socially. It's amazing. So.
Thank you. Thanks, Ava.
And by the way, how is the reception of Conrad going on?
That should be off with the publisher by the end of the year. That's the plan.
Okay.
So I'll be getting in touch with people once once this is all out of the way.
Okay. So are we supposed to do any proofreading or anything? Or
I'll check and get back to people. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. So
thanks, Ava.
Bye bye.